All right, good morning. I'm not used to having a microphone, so hopefully I'm not screaming at you. We gave you a 2-minute grace period. If I give you any more, Jenny's gonna come yell at me, okay? So, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Oak. My name is Alexis Sheffield. I'm the Boyle County Horticulture Agent. I'm very excited to be here today. Hopefully you guys are as well. In fact, they were like, we need moderators as pick me. So hopefully you guys are just as excited. But a few reminders, of course, there's water, tea, everything outside. We're all adults here. Feel free to come and go from the room if you need a bathroom break because, hydration is key here. But we are going to program in sort of a very natural break in the schedule for you all because it is a long morning, but we're going to be so excited we don't want to leave the room, right? Also, if any of you are in extension and you're getting CEUs, make sure you're signing up for those up front. And if you have a pesticide license, if you're a pesticide applicator and you need those CEUs, those signups are at the front desk. I have given most of you a blue feedback card, and if I have not given you one yet, I will. Don't worry, I will find you. And please fill those out and turn them in by the end of the session. I'll come and collect them. And again, I will find you if you did not turn one in, okay? Watching you. And then I'm going to be giving out some handouts as Chris and Krista get started. And then I'm going to do a wonderful introduction. So Krista Jacobsen is an associate professor in the horticulture department at the University of Kentucky. She's the director of the Sustainable Ag and Community Food Systems program. She's used high tunnels in Kentucky since 2011 and is focusing on year-round production systems and better understanding how soil health practices can be incorporated into high tunnel management. Krista and her family have a small organic farm and raise produce and Christmas trees in Anderson County, Kentucky. If you're on social media, you can follow along on that journey at UKY Sustainable Ag. And Chris McKenzie is a farmer development coordinator at Grow Appalachia, a strategic initiative of Berea College. He provides on-farm production support to farmers in eastern Kentucky. Chris's goal is to help farmers increase their profitability and efficiency by implementing scale-appropriate techniques and methods. If you want to follow along with Chris's journey, it's at Grow Appalachia. And I'm going to let them get started.
You have to bear with us as we figure out all this fancy presentation technology here. So, Alexis, thank you very much for that great introduction. Chris and I are going to kind of tag team this beginning part, but we just kind of want to let you know what you're getting into here, kind of a layout. So we're going to start kind of with just, this is just an overview of where we're going over the course of our morning together. As Alexis said, this is a long session. We hope it'll be interactive. If you all have questions, please don't wait till the end. Let's take them throughout. If you have a question, it's likely other folks do as well. So
feel free to slow us down. Feel free to ask questions about your specific farm. We know that a lot of us here in the room are going to have very different farming practices, and we want to try to make this as relevant as possible to you. So jump in.
Yeah, that's right. And so we're just going to kind of go through a little bit of the justification around nutrient budgeting and then some different approaches. If you Google this, you get all kinds of things. So we kind of want to give you the landscape and talk through that. And then we're actually going to spend some time giving you the tools that you need to build a nutrient budget, thinking about everything that's coming into your system, what's coming out, and then we'll kind of add some nuance to that towards the end. And again, feel free to interrupt us anytime. And along with that, we thought, this is just to not belabor the point. I drink a lot of coffee. I know many of us do. Please feel free to get up and do whatever bio business you need to do to make yourself comfortable in here. And then Chris, he always has to slow me down. I drink a lot of coffee and I naturally talk fast, but we thought we wanted to take a moment just to get to know who's in the room, what kind of farm you have, crops you grow. What do you think?
Yeah, I think crops, maybe something about scale in terms of, and if you do, other animal enterprises or things like that, be interested to know about that. So, and maybe what you hope to, something you hope to get out of today's session. Yeah.
So do folks mind if we do a kind of a quick go around? We don't want to, spend tons and tons of time on this, but it'll really help us tailor the content today to just even to know a little bit about your operation. So maybe we can start up front with Angie. You want to go ahead? Oh.
I'm Patrick Graham, I'm the horticulturist.
We're not entirely, the shuffling up here is we're not entirely sure if we should have you all use a mic. They're recording all of this. Just for the sake of the recording. So that's kind of why we look all frenzied up here. Okay. Yeah. Feel free. Carry on, and we'll catch it.
Formerly a horticulture extension agent in northern Kentucky. Small.
Thanks, David.
I'm Nathaniel Fish. I work at Appalachia, and I'm also a pre-college.
Great.
Looking forward to learning more about the
I'm the speaker for us. We are Mac and Marie Miller. We have a small organic farm in Louisville, and we do produce, berries. I'm really getting into a lot of native planting, so that's really why we're here. We're looking to do a lot of soil regeneration, so we kind of last year threw away all of our plans, and we're starting over with soil health and whatnot. We had a really successful year last year, but that's kind of our goal and why we're here.
Hi, I'm Ryan Lewis. I'm an arborist working in Louisville, Kentucky. And for some years, I've been working a lot more on soil ecology and root systems and trees in the city. And that's moved me into stealing ideas from agriculture, because that seems to be where a lot of the action is as far as soil ecology. So don't mind me.
Hi there. My name is Jacob McCowan. I actually work here at the Kentucky State University Farm. I work with the GOAT program, and I'm just trying to sit in on as many talks as I can. My mom and I have 8 acres out in Waddy, Kentucky, and wanting to do some meat birds this year, some layers, and then just build up my soil to do some market gardening. So, yeah.
I'm David Parkhurst from Bloomington, Indiana. I just have a fairly large vegetable garden there, keep a few bees. Coming to this farm reminds me of going to a similar farm at Iowa State University in 1960 when Khrushchev was there. And he said, if our pigs can coexist, why cannot our nations also coexist?
I'm Kevin Allison from Indianapolis, Indiana, right up the street from you, with the Marion County Soil and Water Conservation District. So I help growers with nutrient management, cover crops, no-till, so just learning more.
Great.
Good morning. My name is Kurt Bench with Shared Legacy Farms. I'm co-owner of a vegetable operation. We service 400 members, CSA, wholesale, operate on 40 acres, about 12 to 15 of that as vegetables, mixed vegetables, fun stuff. So looking forward to digging in deep in some nutrient management stuff.
Hi, I'm Maggie Bowlane. I have Old Home Place Farm in Eastern Kentucky, and we do 2 acres of vegetables and grass-fed beef and pastured pork, and some sheep and goats.
Hi, my name is Stefan Johnsrud. We just bought a 5-acre farm. We've been looking for forever. It has 5 acres of Harrison County compacted clay. And I'm here to see what we can do about getting that fixed up and start growing some vegetables. So.
I'm Joe Ulrich, and I work for USDA NRCS. I'm the new urban conservationist in Lexington. And so I'm just kind of getting out to let people know that we exist and we have programs for small scale urban producers, and also to help me learn more as I'm trying to do technical assistance with folks on their operations. I do also have a small operation with my wife in northern Kentucky in Mason County, so also applying some of the things I'll learn here hopefully on that. as well as small vegetable operation.
Hi, I'm Becky Ritchie. I'm an apprentice at That Guy's Family Farm, which is Maggie's family. So nice to meet you. And we do 8 to 10 acres of diverse veggies and flowers.
Hello, I'm Kayla Preston. I'm with Grow Appalachia. I'm the social enterprise manager, which pretty much means I build the high tunnels. I'm your high tunnel person. So if y'all are interested in talking about constructing high tunnels or anything of that nature, give me a shout. And I'm here to support my coworker Chris and learn as much as I can from Dr. Jacobsen and him as well. Thanks.
My name's Emily. I work at Turner Farm in Cincinnati, Ohio. We do about 10 acres of seasonal vegetables and also have livestock. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Alex from High Five Farm, and we lease like 2 or 3 acres, and we just have a little CSA and go to the farmer's market.
Hi, I'm Maggie Duncan. I own Salad Days Farm in Woodford County. We have year-round growing of vegetables, go to farmer's market and do all the things.
All right. Sounds like a lot of smaller vegetable farms. Just a follow-up question. How many folks in the room are certified organic? Okay. Several of you. All right. Yeah, because that's going to be relevant to how we manage nutrients, and there are going to be some things that we talk about that are more specific to organic systems, but can be applied widely to anybody for sure. So, all right. So today's session, we're talking about the big picture of nutrient management, and then really zooming in and talking about creating systems on our farms for monitoring that, for tracking that, and for making sure that we're not over applying, under applying, and we'll talk about why that's important. So first of all, especially for those of us who are certified organic or have other certifications on our farm, we're already required to keep a lot of these records. And doing the nutrient budgeting is just a little bit of a step further, but it means that we've already got a lot of the things that we need in place, right? We are also doing, ag water quality plans and things like that. So the stuff we're talking about isn't really anything new. It's probably stuff that you've been doing already a lot on your farms. It's just a little bit more targeted. And I think, it's always worth talking about the protection of natural resources. That's something that's very near and dear to my heart. And as farmers, I think we all want to be good stewards of the land that, we're on. And, I think agriculture in general gets a bad rap for how we manage nutrients. We've got the bigger picture things of like the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico and things like that. But I just want to say that, this isn't about, this is more about the farm and the production than, us getting up here and shaking fingers at anybody for, mismanaging any of the nutrient issues. I think one of the most relevant pieces that we'll talk about today is crop health, right? So, as we're talking about nutrients and how it affects the way crops grow, I think it's important to think about some of the nuances there. So, for example, pests and disease. If you're applying nitrogen at a bad timing for your crop, you're creating a buffet for those pests and disease, especially if you're over applying nitrogen or something like that. in terms of soil health and soil imbalances, right? So especially for those of us who are growing sensitive crops like tomatoes, for example. If we find ourselves in the middle of the season with some of those soil health imbalances, we're going to see ripening disorders. We're going to see a number of foliar issues, serious diseases in our crops. So that's another thing to consider. And then, of course, finally with that, we've got productivity, right? How do we maximize our plant health for productivity? How do we match up the nutrients, the nutrient needs of the plant with what we're putting into our soils and when that's releasing? All right, and finally, I think one of the biggest justifications that's going to be on a lot of folks' mind is just the dollars and cents of this, right? So I think I don't think it's good to say a blanket statement. Hey, the closer you track your nutrients, the more money you're going to make from your farm. I think you've got to find a good fit for your scale of operation, for what your goals are. But I think if you do that cost benefit analysis between just putting on the same thing year after year and not really paying attention to this, and then really zooming in and finding a perfect system, I think all of us are going to be somewhere in that spectrum in the middle. And we've got to rely on our crop budgets, what we know about our time constraints and things like that to figure that kind of thing out. But I think one of the reasons why this topic is so important right now is, how many of you all in this room are struggling with your input costs right now? Yeah. It's a thing. I'm not a ag economist. I can't look into the future, but I think it's going to be an important thing moving forward. I don't think it's just, the situation in Ukraine. I think there's a much bigger picture going on here. And so as those input costs continue to rise, it's going to be more and more important for us to do a better job of doing that cost-benefit analysis of what we're putting in our soil and what we're getting out of it. So, having said all of that, there's some things that are specific to your farm that's kind of going to dictate how we do this. So, scale is very important. Your goals, whether that be to, not every farm's goal is to, maximally output crops. I know a lot of you are thinking about the stewardship piece. I know a lot of you are thinking about soil health and the health of the crops that you're producing, building healthy food systems. So you really got to consider your goals, and that's going to play a role in what system works for you when we're talking about nutrient management and budgeting. What enterprises are going to be on your farm, right? So especially if you've got livestock and fruit and vegetables, that's going to have a huge influence of how nutrients cycle on your farm. And some farms are managing those things very separately, and some farms it's very integrated. So that all plays a role in what's coming, what's going, and how all of that works. So one thing I'm very conscious of, having been a farmer myself and having worked with so many farmers, especially in Eastern Kentucky, are these time and labor requirements, or these time and labor factors that we have to manage on our farm. All of us have way more to do than we can actually manage with our time and labor. So I think it's really important to to know what our capacity is and how much time do we have to put into thinking these systems, because I think a lot of us as farmers tend to undervalue our time, and that can be really detrimental as we look at things like opportunity costs. You know, what could I have been doing during this time that I'm doing this management piece on my farm that could have potentially been, you know, making more money or improving my farm in different ways. So always have to be thinking about the requirements. So if you are certified organic or have anything else, any other certifications going on our farm, that's going to play a role in how you develop this nutrient management strategy. And what your available resources are. You know, again, I work with a lot of farmers in Eastern Kentucky, and you know, for them to go online and find suggestions of, you know, these specific inputs and things like that, a lot of them just aren't available locally where they're at. And so they have to, you know, mix and match what they have close to their farm, what's accessible, what's cost effective. And so I think, you know, where you're at and what you have access to in terms of inputs, in terms of, you know, locational, you know, geographic considerations, I think is also going to be important. So you heard me a moment ago talk a little bit about opportunity costs. And again, I just want to reiterate that it's really important for us to value our time. So what that's going to mean is that we're going to try to develop and adapt systems that work for us. Let's think about some of the time costs that are involved here with nutrient management. So this is kind of these are kind of the I won't say the downsides, but this is what it's going to cost us to as farmers to do these kind of systems. So we've got to develop and adapt a system, which means that, you know, we've got to figure out if we're going to put this onto an Excel slide. You know, are we going to do this on paper? You know, over time, we've got to figure out how we track this information, what our record keeping systems are going to look like. There are going to be some things that we're going to have to measure, right? So as we go throughout the year, we're going to be doing soil tests. We're going to be doing analyses. There's definitely a time that goes into the decision-making piece. And there's going to be some adaptive management that we have to do as well. So based on, you know, what we find as we develop these nutrient budgets, then we have to change our practices, right? And sometimes that's uncomfortable, sometimes that's time-consuming. But if you're going to take the time to develop these systems, you know, it's really important to also take the time to implement them in a way that's going to be helpful to your farm. So we need to know what we're getting into, and these are some of the kind of the time costs that go into it. Do you have anything else to say around that, Krista?
I think that's really helpful framing.
Yeah. So we've talked about some of the benefits. We've talked about some of the costs. Anybody have any thoughts or questions up to this point? Again, you know, we love to have an interactive atmosphere here, so I'm going to take some pauses throughout the presentation to check in with you all and see how it's going. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Krista for a moment.
We'll trade off a little bit, especially here in this beginning part, as we do some of the kind of framing and setup and like, what are we getting ourselves into here? And so I think really important landscape that Chris has set here. So my job now is just to kind of talk a little bit about what are nutrient budgets, how are they used in different ways, without belaboring the point too much. This is just kind of a level set. When people use the term nutrient budgeting, it can mean a lot of different things to different people, depending on your background. If you're coming from soil conservation service kind of or NRCS kind of framework, it may have a more watershed approach. If you're coming from a farm consulting or a farmer perspective, it may come down to an individual bed or field. And all that term is, it's nutrient budgeting is used for all of those things. So we just kind of wanted to do a level set and say, yes, does count for all of those things, but the gist is the approach, right? So basically we're talking about accounting for the amount of nutrients that are coming in and the amount of nutrients that are being exported from your system. So it kind of invokes the systems level thinking, right? The systems kind of approach. And it can be accounted for on many different scales, from the watershed scale. So I did a postdoc at Penn State, and it was all about Chesapeake Bay watershed, right? And a lot of concern around phosphorus. Whereas in organic farming systems, we may be a lot more concerned about nitrogen management on our farms for crop fertility. So it kind of depends on where you're coming from. We can use them at the farm gate scale. So if you have a really integrated system, so maybe livestock and crops integrated, you may be thinking more broadly than a particular crop. You might be thinking about what's going in or what's coming out of my farm. If you're coming from a biodynamic perspective, we're treating the farm as a whole entity and an organic kind of entity. You know, what you're bringing in, what you're going out takes on a different connotation. So, and a different level of importance maybe than somebody who really doesn't mind buying a bag of nature's safe fertilizer like me. So it really kind of depends on where you're coming from. For the purposes of our talk today, we're really going to focus from a methodological perspective and getting our arms around nutrient budgeting on what's called the soil surface method kind of scale. Basically, it's a crop or field scale. So if you're Googling and looking for more information, you may see the term soil surface method. That's kind of what we're talking about here. But basically, we're talking at kind of the crop or field scale. And that's really for simplicity's sake. When we do breakouts and start developing some nutrient budgeting tools for your operations or for your interests, we can go at whatever scale you all want to. But this is just to make sure we're kind of all on the same page and not overly complicating things, kind of meet everybody where they are. And so basically what we're talking about is what's coming in and accounting for everything in our system. So from our fertilizer to cover crops to even inputs from soil organic matter, and then typically what's coming out. So for most of us, that's crop harvest. We will talk, I'm going to give you an example in a minute of like high tunnels, which are weird in many ways, but we also count for biomass removals from crop residue, which complicates the situation. But for most of us, we're going to talk about crop harvest, and we're going to go through some tools to how to account for some of those things because they can be a little bit tricky to find. So we've tried to bring some resources together so that y'all can have some tools when you leave here. Chris really did a nice job setting up the but why around nutrient budgeting, and hopefully you all are bought in already because you're here and you have an opportunity cost spending time with us versus going to many of these other great sessions, and we appreciate it. So I think the main thing that I would just emphasize out of this is that these are not nutrient budgets are widely used in other parts of the world where there have been tools that have helped farmers do this and not have to go into the depths of the internet at 11 o'clock at night in December when you have time to try to find some random value, right? We need to be able to make this stuff accessible. And so that's kind of our goal. Other governments have done it, but typically it's around where there's regulation for it. So phosphorus loading into waterways, widely used in places like the Netherlands where the whole country is underwater. So they have a lot of, or would naturally be underwater, right? So they have a lot of groundwater, surface water issues. But again, they're most widely adopted where things are kind of farmer friendly. And so that's really where we're trying to come from today and not be overly technical. And I'll talk a moment about that. And then as we started putting together this idea of why a nutrient budgeting workshop, it's really this issue of both rising input costs and availability. I mean, maybe you can afford it, but can you even find it anymore on some of these inputs? I'm just going to take a couple slides to set the stage for where we're moving towards. Okay, so we're going to talk about what goes into a nutrient budget and why they can be useful, and then we'll transition into talking about the nitty-gritty of the ins and the outs. Okay, and along the way, just ask questions and stop us as we go here. Okay, so I'm tiptoeing into here's what we're getting into as we move forward. So just the basics of nutrient budgeting is the approach is just taking stock of what's coming in and what's going out and thinking holistically about everything that's going in there, from the inputs that you bring in, like manures, compost, and fertilizers, to the stuff that you're growing in situ on site, right? Your cover crops, as well as what's mineralizing from your soil organic matter. It sounds easy. We're going to talk about why some of these, some are easier than others, and we'll get into the nitty gritty of how to do some of this stuff. And again, like I said, we're typically on outputs, we're thinking about crop harvest, right? So those are nutrients that we're removing from our fields. They're also, this is our natural capital, right? This is our soil's gift from a nutrient perspective to us that we then harvest and sell. We need to be mindful of that and value it. Know, the dollar amount that comes along with it, but how much nutrient actually is leaving our farm. We'll talk a little bit about crop residue removals. The one thing we won't talk about, and we can go as deep into this or not as people want to, there are, as we get into thinking through nutrient cycling processes, we're not going to go super heavy on that in this workshop. We can if people want to. That's an easy place to get lost, and it's kind of getting into the weeds of particulars around nitrogen management. But we'll talk at a very rough level about leaching and gaseous losses, particularly as they relate to nitrogen, but that's not really the bulk of our time here. But if people have questions, this is going to be my invitation to say, we're not going to go there as a group, but if you want to ask a question, and we will. Okay, so that's kind of, we made a strategic decision about that, not belaboring too much about greenhouse gas emissions and how do you think about leaching losses, because there's not an awesome way to measure it on your farm. That is the purview of researchers, and so we can use some rough numbers, but so just a caveat there. Okay, and so the basics really is your inputs minus your outputs is your nutrient balance. It's just like a bank account type of approach. So where do we start? So Chris in a moment is going to start us at the basics, which is a soil test. Okay, this is going to be a really important baseline. I'm going to do a couple perspective slides and just talk about what we're moving towards so you can see a model of a nutrient budget, and then also how they've helped us improve our management and nutrient management and fertility on the UK organic farm. In a high tunnel example in particular. So a couple of things so we're going to do a breakout session, I've alluded to this, where you all are going to be tasked to think about how can I make this useful to me? Maybe it's a tomato crop or it's a new tree plantation or something like that you want to think through this on. We're going to encourage you to start small and with a crop or a set of similarly managed crops. So it might be your tomato or it might be your brassica field, something like that. So things that are managed similarly, and focus on the nutrients that are of most interest. For most of the time, for organic folks, it's nitrogen management. That is a hard thing to get right, and Chris is going to talk through some of the details of why that's hard to get right, because we're dependent on the goodwill of microbes to provide nitrogen for us in particular. And then it really is just making a list. What's going in, and then review what you have on the farm in terms of data. Your data is always going to be the best data for this. We don't always have data on all these things, and so we're going to try to provide you a lot of resources, but the idea here is that you start with your own farm record keeping and data, and then we fill it in with stuff and then do a little bit of math, okay? So last guiding thoughts before we look at a nutrient budget, and that is try not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And Chris, you did a really good job kind of setting this up, this idea of opportunity cost. This is like, it is a rabbit hole when you start going down this. And you just have to think about, I guess, when I was talking to somebody else from the Organic Association earlier this week about where to focus your efforts, we're going to talk about what kinds of inputs and outputs it's hard to get your arms around on good numbers for. The central mantra, I think, for where to put your effort is what is the volume of something that you're putting in and what is the variability around that. So if you're using like just a smattering of compost, let's say a sprinkling, but compost numbers are very variable, if you're not using that much, it's probably not going to have that huge of an impact on your, if it's, who cares if it's 1% or 2% if you're using this much. If you're using inches of it, it makes a big difference if it's 1 or 2%. Okay, so we're going to kind of talk through that, the importance of variability and volume in guiding how far down the rabbit hole you might go on a particular input. And then Chris talked about this too, but trying to make this manageable and putting it into the units that you're managing your nutrients on. So we can meet you wherever you are on that. A lot of people, it's pounds per acre of a particular nutrient, but it could just as easily, same concept used for pounds per 100 square feet or something like that. This is a scale. You just have to do conversions, right? It's a scale independent kind of thing. And the other thing, the internet is both your friend and also probably your worst enemy at like 1 o'clock in the morning when you're trying to chase down a number. Okay, so there's a lot of good information out there. We've tried to curate some of it for you and help you point you in the right direction where you can find stuff. It's out there. It's just how much you want to dig for it, right? Okay, so we're going to look at a nutrient budget here just so you can kind of get a feel for what this might look like. So this is kind of the how is this useful slide, and then we'll actually get into building some of these for your all's operations as we move along. So this is for organic high tunnel. I do a lot of high tunnel work, as Alexa said in my intro. And we have found that we've had fertility issues over the years. After about 3 or 4 years, tunnel soils start to get a little weird, and I did a lot of tomatoes as research crops, certified organic, managed. I think in much a way a farmer would manage them, not anything super weird out there, and looking at soil processes. And so our standard fertility regime was just what I, from talking to growers, seemed kind of like what folks were doing. So take kind of what folks are doing plus our commercial vegetable recommendations and mash them up. It's kind of, we all kind of come up with the mix of things on our farm. And so we settled on about a 10 ton per acre rate of thoroughbred compost, coming up to about 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and then using 855, a nature-safe fertilizer. And then we're accounting for about a 3% organic matter on that Morey silt loam. And so you can kind of see some associated nutrient contents there. Actually, we have this fancy pointer. Let me see if I can do this without like totally messing up. Let's see, maybe. Did I get it or no? No, yeah? Oh, wow, this is really crazy. I think this is a bad idea. I think I've had too much coffee to do that. So I'll just point. I have long arms, it'll work. So you can kind of see some mineralization from soil organic matter there. So those are our basic inputs. And then we would fertigate in season. And Chris will talk about fertigation and foliar testing and those kinds of things. But that was our basic, what was coming into the system. And accounting for that, both in terms of, we just take our nutrient content, and then that gives us pounds of nutrients per acre per year. I'm not going to go into we're going to go into the details. This is just the landscape. Like, here's what we're getting into, why it's important, and how it helped us tweak our management, okay? So I don't... That's right. So it's kind of a big table, but this is just to kind of, I feel like we're spending all this time like trepidatiously saying like, are you sure you want to get into this? Yes, you do. But I'm going to give you, this is kind of the but why this has been helpful for us. And then our outputs were our crop harvest. We just made some estimates extrapolating out from per plant to per tunnel to pounds per acre per year. We'll walk you through all this stuff. And then I alluded to this before. So in high tunnels, we're removing all that tomato biomass. We pull the crops out from a pathogen management perspective, right? We don't want those, we're going to grow tomatoes in there again, so we pull that out. It's a huge source of nutrients, right, that are in the biomass of that crop. And so you can see kind of the final output here was that even based on all of those things, we come up with being up about 58 pounds of N per year per acre, up on our phosphorus and low on our potassium, based on just kind of following our soil test recommendations and kind of the typical by the book kind of stuff. And then we were also growing these in rotation with greens. And so it's kind of conventional wisdom that like, oh, you may not actually need to apply any nutrients to your green crop. People have different philosophies on this, but the philosophy that we followed was we'll use the greens as kind of a cleaner crop to sop up anything in between the rows of tomatoes and things like that. We probably have enough in the system that we can keep there. So we kind of taking, basically I'm summarizing what a nutrient budget for the kale would look like to give you the punchline, which is over the course of that rotation, we basically clean up our nitrogen, we end up a little higher on our phosphorus, and we're down on the potassium. So what did we learn from doing this? So after about 3 years, has anybody in here had a high tunnel with yellow shoulder tomato? Yeah. Okay, so ripening disorders when you get potassium deficient in tunnels happens, and a big mechanism for that we learned was this pulling out our tomato plants, right? I mean, you don't need a PhD to know this. This is like common sense, but apparently I need to look at data to have some common sense. It helped me understand what was going on here. So it really gave us some mechanistic insight into why are the potassiums being depleted so much faster in our high tunnels versus in the open field, and what's also driving our nitrogen accumulation. So we don't have any leaching. And so we can see that through soil tests, and we also see that our kale has plenty of residual nitrogen to grow. But again, our potassium needs might not be being met. The other piece here, and this is a big issue in central Kentucky where we're on phosphatic limestone soils, we have a lot of natural phosphorus. We probably shouldn't be applying lots of phosphorus, and you could see I was applying compost plus an 855, right? So I had phosphorus in that. So we were not helping our phosphorus levels, even with pulling all of that tomato biomass out of there. So that helped us kind of understand why we were seeing trends in our soil tests. So what did it do to our management? Well, it helped us understand that we need to probably be pushing a fair amount more potassium sulfate on the front end pre-plant, and perhaps focusing more on that versus nitrogen when we're fertigating. We also cut out the compost because we had reasonable soil organic matter levels. For me, when I don't make my living off my work high tunnels, we have the opportunity to cover crop a little bit more. So trying to work cover cropping into a rotation for organic matter management because we were fine on phosphorus and we weren't in like a fixing. Somebody was talking about inheriting or buying 5 acres of Harrison County clay. We weren't in that kind of a situation. We're in pretty nice soil. And then we switched to lower phosphorus fertilizer, so a 1300 instead. So again, all of this helped us understand what was going on, make sense of why we were seeing certain trends in our soil testing, and then make tweaks to the management. So we weren't like throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing. This helps us make tweaks around particular nutrients as we're kind of going along the line. So that's kind of what we're gearing towards. So today we're hoping that you get a handle on thinking holistically about nutrient management. But the last thing we want you to do is go out and change everything, especially if it's working for you, right? But this opportunity to make some tweaks based on kind of an informed approach of what's going on kind of mechanistically. So that's kind of where we're going and kind of what we're working towards. Any questions so far? Okay, cool. So let's get started with where we start, which is soil testing. This is my favorite soil sampling buddy here. So.
All right. So I normally don't do this, but as I drink coffee, I become more eloquent and new thoughts pop into my head. I'm just going to go back really quickly to the justification piece and bring up a point that I forgot to make earlier. I'm eating crow here. All right. So if you consider any one of these pieces, the natural resources, the crop health, the compliance, and the dollars, it can be hard to justify this extra time for your farm. But if you take them all and you put them together, and particularly when you look at that natural resources piece and this piece right here and understand that they're connected, that 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road, or even if you're trying to pass your farm off to your kid, what's in the soil, so what we're talking about today with nutrients, with everything else like that, that's money in your bank. That's what we're drawing, that's the bank account that we're drawing upon, and it's really easy to use that up. And that's why the Natural Resources Conservation Service is here. That's why we have all of these systems in place to think about this bigger picture for farms, because it's been a real struggle. So I just wanted to add that to the justification piece also so that we can start thinking about this more holistically as well. All right, so thank you for bearing with me, and back to soil health. So, soil testing. Usually the recommendation for soil testing is every year. Some folks are doing it every 2 years. If you're certified organic, there's going to be some extra regulations and things like that that pertain to soil testing. But basically, a soil test is going to be a relatively accurate snapshot for that time that it's taken. So this is some data that we don't have to go find on the internet. It's taken on the farm. We know it's fairly accurate. I say fairly. I won't go into detail there, but it's up-to-date data for our farm. But it's not something that we can do all the time. So it's not data that changes and evolves. So it's kind of like steering a cruise ship, right? We look at our soil test, we make the adjustments, and we won't know for another year or two how that adjustment was made, right? So, that's some of the limitations of soil tests, is that we can't take them every week, every 2 weeks. It's just not doesn't make economic sense, right? And it's good for looking at especially phosphorus, for potassium, pH especially, and some calcium and some of those other kind of stable factors, right? Factors in the soil that don't change as much throughout like a 1-year period, for example. Of course, these things are going to change, especially as we remove crops. So for some of us that are doing, for example, multiple crops per season, it might change more or less depending on what you're doing on your farm. Now, where soil tests do not shine is looking at things like nitrogen. So nitrogen is very volatile in the soil. It's going to move around a lot. It's going to get taken up into the atmosphere. It's going to move around in water. But as I'll talk about in a moment, there are some pieces of a soil test that a lot of farmers don't really utilize enough that can speak to that nitrogen piece, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. But for nitrogen, I think it's much more important to do some monitoring in season, and one way that you can do that is with plant tissue testing, because that's a much more accurate measurement of nitrogen. You take a plant tissue piece and you send it off to the lab, and you can get a baseline for your levels that way. So here in Kentucky, we do have plant tissue testing. Right now, I think the lab is down from what I understand. Do you know anything about that? I think it was the lab in Princeton that got hit by the tornado.
This is terrible. I sent things to a private testing lab.
Yeah, Waters, which is a lab in Owensboro, Kentucky, is still doing it. But I, from my understanding, I went to the UK's regulatory website. And I didn't see. From what I saw, it looked like the tornado had damaged the lab that was doing tissue testing. Okay. So maybe their website isn't up to date, or okay. Princeton, great. Well, check with your extension agent. They're going to know where to get that done. UK does have this great publication, Sampling Plant Tissue for Nutrient Analysis. I've got the link there, and I can share this PowerPoint with you all so that you all have these links going forward. So this is just an example of what a tissue test might come back looking like. This one is from Waters Ag, which Grow Appalachia uses as well. So you're going to have a percentage of content for that nutrient within that tissue, and especially Waters gives us this nice little rating scale, so we can see visually where things are at and what might need to be supplemented there. So. All right, so I alluded to earlier, soil testing for organic farmers comes with some some extra things. So for some nutrients, especially micronutrients, you're going to need a documented deficiency. And that's going to be required for some of those inputs. So that's another benefit to doing a soil test every year, so that you can make some of those adjustments and have that documentation to work with your certifier on. There's going to be some soil testing requirements depending on your certifier. It sounds like KDA doesn't require every single year. But yeah, I was trying to hunt down this information before, but it sounds like if you do want to apply things like micronutrients, you're going to need that soil test as a justification. But otherwise, they're just going to want you to have soil tests on a fairly regular basis, because that's, soil monitoring is built into the NOP practices, and so they want you to look at that. So I think it's good to have it done every year, and that way you have it right there with when your certifier comes, and they're seeing that you're doing a good job of keeping up with those records. For those of us that are managing more organically, there's some parts of a soil test that aren't looked at as often that I think can be really beneficial and relevant. So soil organic matter, also known as SOM, an estimated nitrogen release, also known as ENR, can also be really important factors. And I'll show you all what that looks like in terms of a soil test here in a minute. But basically, soil organic matter is going to have a huge impact on our nutrient cycles and how that works. And there's going to be some nitrogen that's released over time from that soil organic matter, which is that estimated nitrogen release. So if we're going to do more accurate assessments of what's available in our soil to use throughout the season, it's really important to look at that organic matter piece and also that estimated nitrogen release. And basically what that estimated nitrogen release is going to tell us is how many pounds of nitrogen per acre is being released over a 1-year period, right? So that's something in there that, if you just look at a regular soil test, maybe you didn't know you had. But I know UK's regulatory service will at least tell you the soil organic matter. I haven't seen an ENR on those tests. But if you go through Waters Lab in Owensboro, they do calculate the estimated nitrogen release for you, so you don't have to do that piece. Yeah, so I think it depends on your goals. So I think for the most part, a lot of farm strategies go ahead and test in the fall because their priority is going to be the pH, right? They need to see where their pH is at and be able to adjust that in a timely manner, because pH takes a while to adjust. With that test in the fall, I think you can also do things like phosphorus and potassium pretty accurately, know if you need to apply compost or manure or other things like that. Those things won't be quite as accurate in the fall as if you had done, a couple weeks before planting. So some farms, if they want to be really accurate with those, are waiting until closer to the planting season to do those soil tests. Yeah. Exactly. Well, and that's another key consideration is what is your actual crop timing? I think fall gets suggested so often because folks are thinking about, spring, summer crops. And if you're a winter grower, which some of us are, taking a break in the summer and growing in our high tunnels and protected ag throughout the season, then that timing isn't really relevant, right? Yes. Yeah, so if you're trying to get a better dial on that potassium particularly, I think it can be more strategic to do that closer to the planting season. So if that's something that you struggle with, if that's, potassium is way more stable than nitrogen, but it's not as stable as phosphorus. So I think and it depends on the crop too, right? How specific do you need to be with that potassium? Because with tomatoes, for example, you need to be pretty specific. So some folks are using that foliar testing for potassium levels as well, right? So it just kind of depends. All this goes back to your goals and your individual circumstances, and that's why I don't give just a blanket recommendation of testing in the fall, because I think it's important to know your system and your timing and how that's working for you. Krista, what other thoughts? Yeah.
I would just add for year-round folks, testing before your most economically important crop.
Yeah.
And where that sits in your rotation. So if it's tomatoes, our main season, and then you've got greens or carrots or whatever in the fall, I'd go before the tomato so that you have the recommendation in hand in time to amend and make, especially if you know that your pH is probably in range due to other recent soil tests, a couple months before your main crop.
Okay, so what about when we're putting in, so we've got 3 rotations that go into test every time?
I don't think so. For a lot of these, nutrients, we consider them not sensitive to management. So we say that they're stable, but you won't see large changes unless you're pulling a ton of nutrient out. You shouldn't see really large changes in your phosphorus and your potassium over the course of a crop. If you're doing weird things like growing indeterminate tomatoes in high tunnels, and you're pulling a lot of biomass out, you may see the needle move more quickly on something like that. But most of the time in the open field, a carrot crop or, other things in the rotation, an annual soil test taken at around the same time in the rotation each year should be fine. And it may be that based on where your most important crop is, as you think about your cash flow through the year, it may be that this part of the rotation, we always sample before the tomatoes, and this we always sample before the broccoli or before the carrots. And so it does kind of add some, when you're really diversified and year round, it adds some complexity. But if you can set it at a rotation point, it might.
Spring, but if it's muddy in the spring,
Yep.
so we then have to dry.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and so you would, in terms of taking the sample in the spring when we're all kind of gearing up and it's closer to the management window, you could and Chris, correct me if you disagree, feel free. But you can back up a little bit if you get a dry window in February or January or December, whatever. If you got a dry window, you shouldn't see tons, because phosphorus and potassium don't leach in large volumes. You shouldn't see humongous changes in a couple of months. Your nitrogen is going to be very dynamic, but we don't test for that anyway, because the snapshot that we take at any given time isn't going to be accurate. So we just give you a textbook value on what we think you should apply regardless of what's there. So,
yeah, it kind of goes back to that cruise ship analogy, right? I think you have to think of this as a way to manage those long-term, more stable nutrients. And then some of the things like nitrogen that are moving faster, that's what we're going to supplement with. And if you do have those multiple crop, like you're doing three successions of crops throughout the season, that's where the nutrient budgeting can come in really handy and help you adjust in season as you go. Whereas with the soil test, I think it's going to be, it takes a lot of time. It takes, soil tests aren't, some counties they're free, but some places they're not. So I think that the soil test is a way to manage the long-term trajectory there. Yes, please. Yeah. Yeah. I did see some data on periods during the year when soil tests aren't as accurate. Krista, do you know, from what I was looking at, it looked like maybe during the summer, particularly when the soils are really warm, that you can get some fluctuations in terms of accuracy?
Is to sample consistently
Mhm.
the year. You see a lot more in uptake and things like that when crops are actively growing.
Mhm.
So, and it depends a lot on moisture too.
Yeah.
You tend to see peaks in microbial mineralization in the spring, and then when it starts to cool down a
Yeah.
little bit in the fall. So,
Yeah.
try to sample outside those windows, but it's more important to be consistent than getting it the perfect timing.
Exactly, because you have those peaks and troughs. If you're not consistent with your timing, you can look at your soil test, say that was taken in the winter, and another one that was in the summer, and you could see a decline when that's really just your system working its way through. So that's a really important point. Be consistent with the timing. Be consistent with the depth, with the method. That way you can compare these soil tests and know that you're comparing, making an apples to apples comparison instead of apples to oranges, right? And for this, I think it's also important to go ahead and standardize, if you're looking at intensive vegetable production, standardizing where you take soil tests in your beds or in your fields, so standardizing the scale, and being able to compare those from year to year so that you don't, you're not trying to compare, okay, well, this bed was in this field this year, but then we took the soil test on the other side of the field next year. So I think consistency is really important. Keep those records, track those changes. Again, I think the soil test provides that baseline, and so in order to do a lot of the work that we're going to do accurately for our farm, this is going to be important data for us to keep and track. I think most folks will tell you to focus on the pH first. That's one of the most important components of that soil test, because if your pH is off, a lot of things that we're about to tell you with the nutrient management don't really apply, right? Because what we know is that pH dictates what nutrients are going to be available to plants. So if your pH is off, and even if you apply a bunch of fertilizer, it may mean that you've kind of wasted your money on that fertilizer if you don't have your pH right. So I think it can be important to consider some of the secondary nutrients depending on your crop goals. I'm just going to give the example of beets in particular, which are really sensitive to boron deficiencies. So know your crop, know what the needs are, and that may mean that you're paying for a little extra to test some of those secondary and micronutrients. But it depending on what your system is, especially if your system is one of those that's that very intensive, high value crop production, it can be important to look at those secondary nutrients as well and monitor those to maximize that system, right? Some of us are doing, maybe looking like, for example, the JM Fortier method, where we're just pulling cycle after crop cycle off of our beds. And that's going to have things changing really quickly, and that's when that level of accuracy can be important. Also, another thing I have a question mark up there to talk about is the Hartz ratio. The Hartz ratio is basically a part of a soil test where we're looking at ratios of nutrients in the soil that's specifically oriented to tomato ripening disorders, right? So we know that some of these nutrient imbalances can create ripening disorders in tomatoes. And so there's this extra part of the soil test you can do that's called the Hartz ratio. I know UK does it. I know Waters does it. But from what I understand, it really just shows you the risk, and it's designed in for systems in California where they can actually just take a field out of production for a little while and move it to somewhere else. So I haven't seen a lot of good. Okay, so here your Hart's ratio is off. This is how you amend and apply around that. So even though I think it can be useful and good data to think about if you're a tomato grower, I don't think there's a lot out there now about how to steer that ship once you know that information. So, do you want to say anything more about soil tests, Krista?
Maybe, and just depending on people's background and where they're coming from, maybe this would be a good opportunity to have any Q&A people want around soil testing, because we'll diverge from this and start talking about inputs and outputs, and people come from really different backgrounds and may want to ask some nuanced questions or some basic questions. I wonder if we might want to talk about soil testing and get any questions out of the way people have. Yeah.
So, and we'll do it on one crop, but then at least the second crop that goes in. How do we, and waters will tell you, like, if it's tomatoes,
Yeah.
what your pH needs to be, and how much lime to add. But if you're going to do that second crop,
Yeah. So the question is, so you get the soil test and you have to check what crop you're growing, and that helps provide the recommendation. But what if you're doing at the entry point of a multi-crop rotation? So the most important thing there is going to be the number, not the recommendation. And then you can take those numbers and say, okay, I'm going to grow a tomato crop. I always have tomatoes on the brain, so feel free to correct me if we need to be talking about something else. But so you take your soil test and it says you have, X, you have, 200 pounds of potassium and, 400 pounds of phosphorus and whatever. You could use a nutrient budget and say, okay, I'm probably going to mine about this much out from this. So then I would assume I'd have about this much left. There's a little bit of problem in that approach because it's an okay approach, but there's a little bit of a problem in that your soil tests indicate what is available to the plant, and we don't always. That may not always line up with crop removal. So basically our crop removal, there's a lot of hand waving around how do we best estimate crop removal. But if you could look and if you're having a heavy feeder, you fertilize to that based on the recommendation. And then if you know that you have a light feeder coming after that, you could make some adjustments on a per crop basis after that. Or the other thing that happens is people check tomato, but it's one soil sample for a field and you're growing a bunch of different crops in that field. In that case, look at the number. So how many pounds per acre of available nutrient do you have in your soil test? And then we match it up with you can use whatever recommendation you like. I tend to use the ID 36, the Kentucky Commercial Vegetable Production Guide. That gives you pounds per acre to apply for every single crop. There's a little table that says you're at low, medium, high, or extra high, or whatever. David, feel free to correct me on what they are, those levels for each crop. And then although that guide is largely for conventional growers, you just do the math based on what you want to use, right? Whatever fertilizer you're using, so that it gives you the nutrient need. So at our place, I'll just use a general test for this field that's been managed in the same way, and then I'll look at what those numbers were and how they equate to whatever crop I'm growing. So I always take academic skeptic. I would take the recommendations with a grain of salt anyway. So yeah, that's a great question.
Excuse me, everyone. I'm sorry for the interruption this morning. There is a vehicle outside in the parking lot, a Dodge Charger red in the handicap parking, and the car has been running for about 3 hours. We were just wondering if anybody in here has a Dodge Charger, you could come outside. Thanks.
I'm glad gas isn't $5 a gallon anymore. Other questions on soil testing? There's a document. It's called ID 36. You have it in here. Yeah, perfect. Maybe
somewhere in here.
Yeah. You can Google Kentucky or UKY ID-36, and it's the Commercial Vegetable Production Guide for Kentucky. And there are other, if you're growing other things, agronomic crops and things like that, there's production guides for all those, and it gives you fertility recommendation, how many pounds of N, P, and K to apply for any crop. And then I always take those and tweak them for an organic recommendation.
Morning. You can take all.
I'll have a link here shortly. It's in here.
Yeah, so the question was, if you have a high biomass cover crop, big, nice rye stand in the spring, and if you take a sample during that, is that going to affect your levels? It might. You may be a little lower, particularly on the potassium. Depending on what part of Kentucky you're in, it's real hard to move the needle on anything but high for phosphorus. So it may not make a big difference from a management perspective. Numerically, it might be different, but does it like actually affect, is it high or extra high? May not make a big difference. But the potassium might, particularly with grasses. Grasses are really good foragers of potassium. So it may take it up. But that being said, it does take a while. So let's say you've immobilized a lot of potassium in the biomass of a cover crop or in a pasture, for example. So if people are going into pasture ground and breaking ground, you've got a lot of potassium bound up in the biomass of that crop. It's not necessarily a bad thing to take the sample then, if that's a good window for you, because it's going to take time for those microbes to mineralize all of that and for it to become available in the soil solution. So it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing if you're putting in a crop that is a heavy fruiting crop and it has a high potassium need after that, to take it then. It's going to take a little while for that stuff to become available. But yeah, it could numerically, it would be different. Yeah, but maybe not even wildly different, depending on where your baseline levels are. It's a little wishy-washy, but. Yeah, okay, this is a fabulous question, and it's like I'm totally obsessed with this area right now. So the question was, if you have a really high organic matter soil, like we sometimes see in high tunnels or in biointensive systems, and you're at like 10% organic matter, so normally our soil, we were just talking about this before this. Chris is like, what do you tell, do you have a target for soil organic matter? And I'm like, no, because, our soils, natural soils, whatever that is, hit a natural plateau that is a balance between decomposition and new biomass inputs, right? And so for much of us, it may be that it's really hard to get above 4 or 5% unless you're applying a lot of compost, or you're doing like no-till with a lot of compost and the soil surface is very, very high in organic matter. So the question was, does a regular soil sample, does that behave under like a Malic 3 extraction, what a normal extraction would be in Kentucky? And the answer is, you're exactly right. You should be using a saturated media extract. Analyze it like a green. So what that means in a soil test is check the greenhouse media box. Your soil will behave more like greenhouse media at very high organic matter levels. This is particularly true for high tunnel producers. And this is something I've learned from folks in New England in the past couple of years doing this big regional project. So you get basically what the soil testing service at the University of Maine has found is that saturated media extract, because basically instead of taking that soil sample and analyzing it in a solution that is at the pH, basically what most soil tests do, a standard soil test, is they take your soil and they dump it in a heavy acid that is meant to simulate the environment that a root exudate has. So it's a really low pH, it's like 2 or something. And that's supposed to simulate the environment around a root. And that's how they pull out what the plant available nutrients are. Well, what happens in a saturated media extract or in these really high organic matter soils is that what's actually in the solution, in the water in the soil, is a better indicator of what growers experience in terms of fertility, availability, and issues than what that that low pH extract does. And so when you get above 7, 8, 9% organic matter, a saturated media extract is probably going to more accurately reflect the nutrient availability to your plants. That is an awesome question. Yeah. And that's, yeah. So if you're submitting a sample to UK, you would want to let your county agent know what you're thinking, and that it's a soil sample, but you want to analyze like a greenhouse media, and so it's a greenhouse media extract. That so then UK will know to not do the Malic 3; they'll do a saturated paste. I love that question. Sorry, go ahead.
You said 6-7%.
Oh, you're gonna be hard. Yeah, I was gonna say you're gonna have to pin. I don't know if I can be pinned down on that. I would say if you're composting a lot and you're above like what your native soil would be, like let's say many of us 3-4% of organic matter might be kind of where we top out. What you might do is run it as both if you think you're on the bubble. And then you can compare and contrast. We've done that a lot, both with Waters and with UK, if we're just trying to get our arms around like where do we fall on this. And your numbers will be pretty different, particularly on your potassium. And so then you have to decide what do you do with that from a management perspective. And I tend to go pretty conservative, especially with like tomatoes and potassium and things like that, and go and don't skimp. But that's me being a little conservative on that. Conservative from a producer perspective, maybe not financially conservative, but yeah. Other questions on soil testing? So the biological tests, like what? Oh, Haney tests. So like where you're doing like CO2 bursts and things like that. I think the nice thing about soil respiration, Haney tests, any of the like the soil health carbon oriented measurements is that they give you, so soil organic matter is hard to move the needle on in a 1 year kind of time period. And so these measurements of active organic matter, sometimes they're called, or CO2 burst respirations or Haney tests, they give you an indication of microbial activity in the soil or biological activity in the soil around carbon. And so it can kind of help you know if over time, it's basically like more sensitive than a soil organic matter test. It's also extremely variable seasonally. So you're going to have wildly different results, even if you haven't done anything, if you sample in the winter versus in the late spring. So I would say from a soil testing perspective, that like the traditional soil science community, for better or for worse, is the jury's still out on those. I think they're really useful for the individual person. If you're making a lot of changes, or you're like really wanting to know, is my cover cropping practice getting better? You know, those kinds of things. The most important thing, well, there's two really important things. One is that consistency in sampling time becomes increasingly important on those. So you really need to sample at the same time every year. The other thing is that those are not the soil samples to let sit on the dashboard of the truck. Those are active microbes that their activities being measured. So you sample and it goes to the lab.
If you can carry a cooler or something like that, if it's going to take a while to get between point A, point B, that can be useful.
Yeah, 100%.
All right, so we're at about a 90-minute mark. So how are y'all feeling? Do we want to push on? Do we want to take a break, take 5 minutes, get some coffee, use the bathroom? How are folks feeling? All right, let's do it. All right, good deal. So we'll take about, 5 minutes? 5 minutes work for you all? Yeah. Great. All right, we're going to get fired back up here in just a moment, folks, so get comfortable. Yeah. So how are y'all feeling? Are your brains fired up? Are you keeping up? Are you excited about numbers and nutrient management? You know, I wonder if we should have done this in the afternoon when there was a little bit more brain power going around, but I know my brain is lagging a little bit this morning. There you go. All right. Yeah. Perfect. Well, caffeine is going to be the appropriate tool for us to get through this next section. Pretty soon we're going to jump. We're going to do the deep dive into the numbers. So just letting you know we're still doing the setup, and then the application comes here soon. So I did want to talk a little bit about inputs, and I think it's important if we're doing this nutrient budget to really consider all of the inputs that might be going on to our farm, because if we're not, we're really, this nutrient budgets isn't as helpful when we're just looking at, for fertilizer, for example. So, but fertilizer is definitely a component. So most of us are familiar with, the analysis on a fertilizer bag. That those three numbers are going to be your nitrogen, your phosphorus, and your potassium. And then, there can also be micronutrients later on in that series of numbers, but usually they'll have those specific nutrients listed, and then also give you a percentage along with that too. But the three big ones are if we've got 3-4-3, that means we've got 3% nitrogen, 4% phosphorus, 3% potassium. Of course, there's going to be nutrients in manure as well. Nutrients in our cover crops, especially if we're growing a legume cover crop that's actually fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere and putting it into the soil. We're buying seed, we're growing that cover crop, it's scavenging the nutrients that are already existing in the soil, but also pulling some in from atmosphere, maybe pulling some from deeper in the up from the roots. So I'm not going to talk too much about that because we've just kind of covered that. So with manure and compost, I think it's important to note that the nutrient contents for those are going to be highly variable. Generally, they're good sources of phosphorus and potassium. Particularly phosphorus is going to be a high with a lot of the, especially the manure-based compost, and of course the manure as well. The nitrogen is just going to be highly variable depending on, what stage of decomposition it's in, what are the different components of that compost. Is it a food waste compost? Is it, manure-based? With manure, how much of it has, how exposed has it been? Has it been leaching off as it's been breaking down? So really the only way to accurately know these things is, again, to do testing. Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting that you have to test these inputs every time that you put them on your farm. Oftentimes it can be beneficial to get, know that you have a consistent source that's going to be somewhat consistent in terms of what it is, and go ahead and test that, and then use those test results as you plan your nutrient budget. And then maybe a couple years down the road, if you see things start to change with that input, if it seems like it might be a little hotter or less broken down or something like that, you can test again. Again, both Waters and University of Kentucky have those, have the way to test those. This is just an example of what that might look like. Gives you some water content. It looks like it comes in pounds per ton. So don't get confused by pounds per acre there. We got some different units happening. So pay attention to that. So in that, you're going to need to know, what's your tonnage of application. And tonnage is a little bit tricky, I think, because that there's a lot of water content involved there. So I'm not, that might be tons of dry matter. Do you know? Okay, it is tons of dry matter. So, so the difference between dry matter, just to cover that really, really quickly, don't want to go down a rabbit hole here, but so that's dry matters is after that manure or that compost is completely dried out, what's left there. So you can't really compare that to, I get a shipment that's 5 tons of compost. You can't really say that that's going to be 5 tons of dry matter. So you've got to do a little bit of conversion there, and that's why they give you that water percentage as well. That helps you do that calculation. I think, I wouldn't necessarily consider crop residue as much of an input, but it is something that's going to factor into the overall nutrient budget, whether that crop residue is removed or whether it stays on the farm, right, or stays in place, right? Even if we're taking that residue and we're putting it somewhere else on the farm, that's still a way that nutrients move around in the soil. So that's something that, depending on how accurate we want to get with these nutrient budgets, that's something to look at. Is, we know that some portion of that crop is going to be the harvestable portion, right? Whether that be the fruit or the leaves or whatever else it is. And so that's going to be being pulled out over time, right? But there may be some situations where the stalk or the stem or the leaves might be being reincorporated, and that's going to play a role. And as cover crops or that crop residue get reincorporated, that's where we enter some really tricky dynamics in terms of timing, right? That's where we run into, okay, we know these things are in the soil in some form, but when does that transition to a form that plants can take up and utilize? So anything in terms of cover crop or crop residue, we know that at first a lot of those things are can be a little bit tied up, especially depending on what that residue is and how much, what the growth stage is. We can get into a lot here. This is a true rabbit hole, but I'm just trying to give you kind of the thought process behind this. So one factor here is estimating plant available nitrogen. As we've kind of spoken to, some of those other nutrients are a little bit more stable in the soil. So the big one that's moving around here is going to be nitrogen. And that nitrogen is affected by a lot of different things. It's affected by, the stage of growth that cover crop or that crop residue was in. If you've got a fully grown rye cover crop, that's going to be mostly carbon, and that nitrogen is going to be very much tied up. So even though you're tilling it back into the soil, it's going to take a very long time for that to be available to plants. Whereas if you've got a much smaller, not as woody, same example, if you do rye at a much earlier stage, then that nitrogen gets released a lot faster. Now, legumes are an example of a cover crop that usually do have a pretty high moisture content, and so they're going to break down and release nitrogen a lot faster than something like a rye cover crop. So this especially gets tricky when you're looking at cover crop mixes. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to do some assessment of cover crops and what the potential contributions of nitrogen and other nutrients could be. So, but I just kind of wanted to set the scene in terms of how this acts as an input or another factor that will go into that nutrient management plan. So another thing to consider is, like I spoke to earlier, is your organic matter and your estimated nitrogen release. So this is a Waters Ag soil test, which gives us both of those values here. Actually, with Waters, that comes with your standard soil test, which is really nice. If you go through the UK regulatory lab, you can ask to have that soil organic matter, but it doesn't do that estimated nitrogen release calculation for you. So that's going online and finding another calculation to make. So what this ENR tells us is that we've got 59 pounds of nitrogen per acre that's going to be released over a year's worth of time. Now, that's helpful, and it's also a little tricky because, I would say it would be difficult to, because that nitrogen is going to be being released, slower during cooler periods and faster during warmer periods, for example. It's hard to just take that division and calculate out, how many pounds of nitrogen per week you're going to get. But it's still a helpful number to think about. Okay, if we've got that 59 pounds available in the soil, maybe that's a little bit that we can cut back on in terms of other nitrogen inputs. And for us, those of us who are really feeling the cost of our fertilizer inputs in particular, that can be a helpful thing to work with, to know that extra piece is there. Yeah. Do you have anything to throw in there? Mm-hmm.
The question is, just for recording purposes, the question is, can you think about something about availability, and can you do some hand waving around that? So one quick thing, you can get the ENR from any organic matter content. Waters uses a factor of 20 pounds per % organic matter. So if you do a soil test at UK and they give you an organic matter percentage, they won't give you an ENR, but you can estimate 20 pounds of nitrogen per % organic matter. Okay, so you can do that off any soil test. It's a calculated factor. It's not a separate analysis that they run. Some people say between 20 and 30 pounds, but 20 is conservative. And then in terms of when that might become available, so that's going to be a function of microbial activity in the soil. And in temperate climates, so like our open fields, tunnels are a little weird, but in a temperate climate, you typically see soil microbial activity peak in the late spring. So around the times that our like rye vetch mixes are just going crazy and reaching maturity, that's about the time, kind of late May, mid to late May, depending on the year, that's where you see a burst in soil microbial activity. So this is also why if you're taking a biological soil sample, like a Haney test or something like that, it's going to be wildly different if you take it, and much higher than if you take it in the peak of the summer after, because what's happening is that the soil organic matter that's been either frozen in really cold climates or really slowly decomposing in the wintertime when it's wet and cold. Once there's a lot of latent organic matter there that then once the soil warms up, the microbes start chewing through rapidly as the soil warms. It hits a trough in the middle of the summer, and then it tends to peak, but not quite as high in the like mid-fall. That's a great question. But I also would not be pinned down on a particular,
Yeah.
but you'd expect the big slug of it in the spring.
Yeah.
Talked in previous conferences about like the 10% organic matter discounting that ENR is directly that factor.
Mm-hmm.
So use that in subtracting your overall requirement estimation, and because it's a derived factor of the organic matter, so you disregard the organic matter if you use ENR.
Yeah, E and R is organic matter. They're inextricably tied in that way. Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Just what's theoretically there.
In the system that's being released, available to plants over a 1 year period from what I understand. Yeah. So think about how long your crop is in the ground, when that crop is in the ground, and pull your numbers from there. So, all right. I think we've covered that. All right, so I've alluded to it before, but the role of pH in all of this is that that timing factor. So pH is one of the slower things to get adjusted in your soil. And as we've spoken to before, it's really important in terms of how your plants are going to uptake and react to nutrients. So we've got this helpful chart that just shows a pH range from 4.0, which is strongly acidic, up to 10.0, which is strongly alkaline. And we see here that magic line of 6.5, where a lot of those both macro and micronutrients have their best availability. So that's why when we get soil test recommendation back for most fruits and vegetables, it falls within that line. Now, some examples of divergent crops would be things like blueberries, which need much higher levels of iron, and so they like a more acidic soil. But for the most part, we're looking at that 6.5 target. And so when we're looking at a soil test and the recommendations, when we put that lime down, it's reacting pretty slowly. I think 3 to 6 months for full adjustment, depending on your soil type, depending on the moisture content, depending on if it's incorporated or not, right? So if you leave it on the top, it's going to work much slower than if you're able to incorporate it and let the moisture and microorganisms start breaking that down, right? The lime product that you use is going to be a factor. So if you get just big chunks of lime from your local lime quarry, that's going to break down a lot slower and take a lot longer to adjust your soil. So just wanted to give this as another thought in terms of your timing and how that corresponds to some of the nutrient timing that we're going to be talking about later. Krista, I think this is your slide. Yeah.
Okay. So we'll start talking about outputs here in a minute, but again, in the spirit of getting it right or close enough to be right, to be functional, to help you make management decisions. Kind of the hardest things to get good numbers on, because they tend to be variable, are composts. So one way you can do this is if it's compost made on farm, you want to send it off for a sample. Most vendors of compost will have an analysis that if they're a secondary vendor, like your local landscaping company that you pick up a truckload from, they can probably get it from their supplier. If somebody's selling compost commercially, they are testing. Yeah. Yep. Oh yeah, absolutely. So the question is like the nitrogen content in compost. So typically you're only talking 1 to 2% nitrogen, but we're often applying a lot, so it ends up being a lot. So there are varying schools of thought on how to think about availability with compost. Some people say, we know it's a slow release fertilizer, right? So because the microbes have already chewed through everything that was easy to break down, right? So everything is going to be slowly decomposing. And so some people say a 5-year timeline for release. So you'd take your total amount of nitrogen that's applied and divide it by 5 and say that's what's going in every single year. Some people say 10 years. Some people say it's a straight line and you just assume 20% release per year for 5 years. And some people say it's actually higher in the first couple years and then it peters. So there's lots of schools of thought. My school of thought is that you should be applying compost as a soil amendment and not a nitrogen source. Okay, so from a soil health perspective, and I'm hypersensitive to this with high phosphorus soils where we're in central Kentucky, you apply you apply compost up to your phosphorus need. And then beyond that, you supplement with an additional nitrogen fertilizer. That's a very conventional school of thought around nutrient management that sometimes isn't the reality for most of us. So, just do that with that what you will. That's the conventional school of thought on that. But we definitely, regardless of how you're using compost, you want to use it as a soil amendment and not a soil fertility source, in part because it doesn't behave unless you have like tons, unless you have applied 3 or 4 inches of compost. And if you have, that's okay. I mean, I think a lot of times people hear like, oh my God, I way over applied. I can't even talk to these people now. I committed a cardinal sin. It's not like that, but just know you've got a lot of fertility in there and you may not need to top up, certainly with anything phosphorus related. I would if you're applying a small amount. So like that 10 ton per acre that I mentioned in that nutrient budget, that's like a 1/4 inch of compost, even less. It's really like 1/8 of an inch. I would count it mentally, but I wouldn't count it being available at a time that my plants need it. Like I wouldn't not do a pop-up fertilizer at transplant, like fish emulsion while I'm transplanting my crops or something like that because I did the compost. Does that make sense? But again, if it's volume, so if you are applying lots and lots of compost, I would count it because it's there and it'll save you money on applying other things because you've already got it. Yeah. Oh, yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question.
Something else to note about compost is it also will change and adjust the pH a little bit. It tends to bring things more towards neutral. So, if you are trying to save a little bit on lime and you're applying compost heavy, for example, it might not be as efficient to, add all of the lime, knowing that your compost is going to adjust things.
Yeah, it has some buffering capacity there. Absolutely. Mark and I were just talking about this before. I did my PhD work at Georgia, in the University of Georgia, on an old cotton terrace, and the pH was about a 5. We got a lot of buffering capacity out of organic matter. It was a no-till organic project, and we never limed, and I'm not going to tell you to never lime if your pH is 5, but in that particular context for that experiment, we got a lot of buffering capacity out of the compost. Yeah. Yeah, it's great. Yeah. That's absolutely right. Yeah, there could be way different chemistry going on climatically, and it was also a good bit warmer and wetter there. And so probably the nutrient cycling processes and the microbial processes were a little bit different. There may have been a lot of nutrients in that depleted soil coming right out of the compost and immediately available to the plant, or right out of anything else that was being added. Whereas in more temperate climates, we might see those nutrients adhere to the soil organic matter and then be released to the crop plant. This is getting into the weeds, but it's a fundamental difference between nutrient cycling in temperate systems versus the tropics. Yeah.
I think it's also an important consideration if you're taking a soil test and you're dumping a huge amount of compost on top, you got to ask yourself, how useful is that soil test going to be when the root zone of the plant for the first several inches is going to be in compost, right?
Yep.
For the most part, I think, if you are in a conventional tillage situation, it's a good idea to go ahead and try to, mix some of that in to try to get the compost a little bit deeper, make sure the roots are going down as deep as they need to be to find that nutrition. But for some of us, we're doing these no-till practices where that compost is just that big layer on top, and that's going to have a huge effect on, you know, how you use your soil test and how you use your compost
Yep.
test as well.
Yep. Any questions around that? That's a really good point. Yeah, especially with a lot of folks doing reducing tillage, whether you're full on organic no-till or not, but with the tillage reduction, it really affects the nutrient availability in the soil profile because you've created a stratified soil profile instead of a mixed one. And that's not a bad thing. You just have to be mindful of it, because you're trying to take a test on what the plant roots are experiencing, right? So that's what you want to think about. If I was a plant root, where would I want my temperature to be taken, basically? Mixing metaphors there, but okay. Okay, so cover crops, we can go this is your all's choice. This is the choose your own adventure part of this here. So estimating nutrient content out of cover crops is a little bit challenging. There's a great session tomorrow, Hannah Poffenbarger and somebody else, I don't know, is doing on this. The reason I have it on here, we can do some of that and talk about destructive versus non-destructive sampling and things like that. So we can talk through some of that stuff here today. If people are heavy cover cropping, there's a lot of variability around nutrient inputs from cover cropping. But we'd take 15, 20 minutes to talk about that. But I kind of wanted to see where folks were. So couple of, like 3 options I can see. We can do a vote if we want to here. Feel free to guide me. So we can just not do it and say like, yeah, cover crops are important. Somebody else can handle that. I'll go to Hannah's session. The second thing would be we can talk about that now, how to estimate nutrient content from cover crops in a couple methods. The other way we could do it is we're ramping up to do a breakout session and talking through that, and we could talk about it in small groups and do it with some mixes of your choice. Or we could do a little bit. I guess there's 4 options. I could go light on some methods, and then we could go in a little more detail with people who wanted to. How many people are like, oh my God, please don't talk about that? Okay, great. Well, then maybe, okay. How about, what was the second one? Do deep dive now. Deep dive now? Okay. Okay, deep dive now. Okay, medium dive? Medium dive? Okay. Okay, we'll do medium dive. I'm gonna fast forward a few slides. Okay. Okay, here we go. Okay. Okay, I wasn't totally sure where people would want to go on this. So this is it is a rabbit hole. It's a little bit, for most of us that are doing diverse cover crop mixes, it can be hard data to get and hard to get right. Okay, so there's kind of 2 methods, right? There is a destructive method where you like take a physical sample and you get that submitted to a lab and have it run, and then there's some non-destructive ways to do that are just it's not that taking a sample is wildly difficult, but it's like one more thing in the spring usually, you know. It can be cumbersome. But just to break down what this would look like for folks, and again, this is probably getting data from like the internet or something like that gets harder the more complex your mix is. So if you're doing some really cool 5-way mix of a couple legumes, a couple grasses, and a brassica of some kind, whatever, visually looking at that and being like, well, it's about this percent this percent this, it's this tall, whatever, that gets hard to get right. And the question is like, do you need to? If it's only this tall, maybe who cares? But if you've got some gorgeous cereal rye stand that's, 5 feet tall or something by the time you terminate, it's got a bunch of cool stuff in the understory, you might want to take a sample of that. So you don't have to make this overly complicated. You just have to take a sample of a known area of it. And what we do at the Hort Farm, this is not a fancy scientific thing. We take PVC pipes and we make a 1-foot square and just flop it over the top and cut it. And we don't worry about the roots. We know we're not getting it right because we're not counting root biomass, but we're getting it good enough to get the above ground biomass. And there's some literature that says that actually roots of cover crops typically may not even be available till year 2 anyway. So in terms of your nutrient budget, there's enough stuff there that we say, we just worry about the above ground portion. So what you would do is you would take a sample of that around the time that you would be terminating it. It doesn't necessarily have to be the day of, but within a couple of days, because as Chris said, maturity makes a really big difference in the nutrient content, particularly if the plant, well, both in terms of biomass, if it's actively growing, so how much there is, but also in terms of phenological stage of the plant, the maturity level. So as plants grow, early in life, their job is to grow big and strong so that they can meet their mission in life, which is to reproduce, right? So you're putting all of your energy as you mature, if you're a plant, into your seed. And so as plants move from vegetative to reproductive stage, so grasses putting on seed heads, legumes flowering and putting on seed and things like that, the nutrient content will typically, or nitrogen in particular, will go down, okay? So it's really important, long-winded way of saying, take the sample, like within the week, probably, of when you're going to mow or whatever you're going to do to that cover crop. And then you're going to dry it. It doesn't have to be crazy dry. It has to be dry enough that when you send it to a lab, it's not going to rot in transit. Because if it starts to decompose, your nutrient analysis is going to be off. And so ship it in a paper bag. Send it to Waters or whomever. If it's some humongous sample, because it's like a big rye cover crop stand, you just need to send a representative sample. You can send them the whole thing. You can chop it up into pieces with a hedge clipper, something like that. But just send them enough. They need basically a big handful. That'll give them more than what they need to run it. And then just send it to a testing lab. Don't send it to UK. It'll take forever. That's a terrible thing to say, but if you need it in a timely way, like you do for that particular sample, because it's going to affect how much nutrient you're going to put in the next week, send it to a private testing lab. That'll crank through it pretty quick. Okay, should turn off the recording for that, but so that is the tried and true way to get the best number. Oftentimes that is not what we have time for in April or May or whatever, but it may be something that you do once, and then it helps you eyeball a visual estimate later, right? So you can use it as a learning tool or something like that, but that really is the gold standard to get an accurate sample. There's a few other ways to estimate. And again, I personally am terrible at this. I also can't go out and say, oh yeah, that field is like 2 acres. I'm like wildly off on that stuff. So maybe y'all are better at this than I am. But when I have done a visual estimate versus taking a sample and compared the numbers, I'm all over the place. So all of this to say, this can be kind of a hard thing to get right, but there's lots of good resources online from universities around how to make visual estimates of cover crop biomass. So I have a few of those on here that I'll show you for reference that have QR codes and you can get to and stuff. But the general rule of thumb is you'd go out there about the time that you're terminating it with a yardstick, or if you have a forage stick or something like that, and just measure the height of the crops, okay? And if it's in a mixed stand, what you're going to want to do is say, okay, my vetch is about, 12 inches tall. My rye is 36 inches tall. Let's just stick with 2. And then you're gonna want to say, okay, so for grasses, small grains, and legumes that are not at like full flower, about 6 inch height and 100% ground cover is about 2,000 pounds of dry biomass per acre. So what we're doing first is we're using the height and the percentage of cover to estimate biomass, instead of taking a measurement and saying, okay, we're weighing 1 pound of this 1 square foot of dry biomass and multiplying it times 43,560 square feet in an acre. We're going to visually estimate this as like, it's great if everything's 6 inches tall and you have a carpet of cover crop, right? Nobody has 100% cover. The way you estimate that is you look down and take a snapshot and you see how much ground you see, how much soil do you see. If you think about half of it is, so you kind of, again, you're visually estimating. And just do a small area. It actually helps to put out, like you can even put out 2 little rulers or something and say, okay, that's about 1 foot. I see in this quadrat, in this quarter, it looks to me like maybe about 1/4 of it is soil. And over here maybe is about 50% soil. Over here is maybe 75%, those kinds of things. So you're kind of getting a rough ballpark on percent cover, and then you're measuring height of those of the crops. Okay, and so that gives you your percent cover, and then you get your height, and then for every additional inch of growth, you're going to add another 300 pounds of biomass. So let's say that that vetch was 1 foot tall, so you do the 2,000 pounds for 6 inches, and then you add another 1,800 pounds, right, for the other 6 inches. So that for that vetch that's 100%, I'll get to the correction there in a minute, that would be like 3,800 pounds. If you had a carpet of veg, can't see the ground. If you can see the ground on about half of it, you'd be 900 pounds of dry biomass an acre. Does that make sort of sense? Okay, so you're trying to get a visual estimate of biomass, and then you would go through and multiply by what the nutrient content would be. And this gives you dry biomass. So if you actually harvested this and like weighed it on a scale, it wouldn't be right? Because that's wet biomass, that's fresh biomass. Those particular nutrient contents are based on dry biomass. You can actually dry it if you want to. Just stick it in an oven like 150 degrees. Don't forget about it. But that will dry it out. That's basically all these labs do, is use a low oven, like on warm or something like that. It just happens to have a fan. So you can do a lot of this stuff at home. Okay, we will not do this. We basically just did this and talked through it. But we can talk through that. This is basically just taking that estimate that we talked through and applying a nutrient value to it, a percent nitrogen. So 3-4% is pretty common for a legume. Yeah, Maggie. Yeah, that's an awesome, that's an, Well, so that's an awesome question. So just for posterity here, the question is if you have a like a sorghum Sudan grass or something else, or even a millet, something that you're going to mow and is going to come back, would you take that sample every time? And I think it really depends on what you're trying to do. So from a nutrient budget perspective, I wouldn't take it at all because it's not new nitrogen in the system with like a Sudex, because it's just it's not a legume, right? So it's not bringing in new biological nitrogen. It's just moving around. It's scavenging what's in the system and putting it back in. So if I'm looking to cut an input, I wouldn't even count it. If I was trying to think through when is that going to be available to my crop plant, everything that's mobilized in there, I would visually look at it and see how broken up is it. I know that's not really your question, but if like for something like that, it's a lot of times the grasses that we're mowing and they're coming back. We don't often, I'm trying to think, does anybody have a legume that they would mow and pop back? I'm trying to think. In that case, I would take it both times if it was a legume, because the majority, in most of the time, the majority of the nitrogen in a legume is going to be from biological nitrogen fixation from the atmosphere. So in that case, I would. So if you're doing a cut and come again on, or mowing and then coming back, clovers will often pop back, things like, so if that were happening, like you mowed it and then didn't get to that field and we're like, oh, well, it's growing back anyway, I'll mow it again in June or whatever, then I would use both because they would both be inputs. Yeah. Is that okay, Maggie? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would do it one time. Yeah. But I would also realize that grass is not, from a nutrient budget perspective. So from a nutrient budget perspective, where I'm trying to think about like what's coming in and what's going out, I wouldn't even measure it because it's cycling in the system, right? It's not affecting, nothing new is coming in and nothing is going. If I wanted to know how much biomass was there, because I'm thinking about like how much nutrient is cycling in there, then I would just probably do it once. I think, because it's not, maybe at first cutting, because I wouldn't want to overestimate. That would be my bias would be towards not wanting to overcount nutrient that's in there, because you don't want to come up too lean. Other people might answer that question differently. It's a really good question. Yeah. Okay. Pat.
There's a lot of speculation about cover crops being able to mine less available nutrients, like actually pull them out of deep reaches of the soil.
Yep.
Where they otherwise wouldn't be available to crop plants. And this is like things other than nitrogen. Is there research to support that that's happening? And is there a way to maybe not even numerically account for it, but at least think about it in terms of what your nutrient budget?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So using cover crops to mine nutrients that might not be available in the soil. especially not nitrogen. Yeah, I think there's good research on that in both phosphorus and potassium. So a little bit different mechanism. So we'll start, potassium's a little easier. So potassium is because it's not bound quite as tightly to the soil as phosphorus is, just based on its electrostatic charge. And so a lot of times grasses are very effective foragers of potassium because of their root architecture. They have those fine roots, like really vibrant root systems that get into pockets of soil where something like mustard or something like that maybe has more of a taproot type structure has fine roots, but it's not like a mat like a grass is. So grasses would be potentially mobilizing that, or at least keeping it cycling. I don't know that I would count it in a nutrient budget because again, they're not fixing anything. But it's good to know that, right? And particularly if you think leaching might be a problem. Potassium, as Chris said, nitrogen leaches a lot more than things like potassium, but potassium can leach. So keeping it in your system. Yeah. So you may want to skew towards that, right? Yeah, because you want to keep it in place. Yeah, having a grass there, both from a erosion perspective and yeah. And
Consider a grass preceding tomatoes because of the potassium.
Yeah, and so we've actually seen grasses immobilize potassium too. Because you have to. So the thing about using the cover crop is it's only good to the succeeding crop if it's good and dead, right? And decomposed all the way. And even if sometimes visually stuff looks like it's decomposed, the microbes might not be done with it yet. So your cover crop, like you said, with the nitrogen, we often think about that with nitrogen immobilization, but we've actually done work at the farm where we'll use we'll do like an experiment where we're like a grass, a legume, and a grass and a legume. And anything that's heavy on the grass, the tomatoes come up short on potassium. So it takes a while to cycle through that. And maybe you can get around it with not putting all your eggs in the grass basket and having like a really diverse mix. But I would just make sure it's, give yourself a good run up. A lot of times when we're thinking about nutrient availability, like the graph that Chris showed, we're like, how close can I run my termination to make sure I get that peak in mineralization, right? So it's available to my plant. But it's really easy to shoot yourself in the foot and like not have stuff broken down. And that happens a lot when we're like racing to get a cover crop terminated because the weather hasn't been right or we want a little more growth on it and we're running up too close to our planting dates. So give yourself a couple more weeks than you think you need, and like maybe you lose a little bit of the nitrogen, but then you don't run the risk, especially if you have a heavy biomass cover crop. If you're incorporating it and you might have some immobilization, like give yourself a good window.
Because of the weather here in Kentucky, more often than not, I see what happens instead of people terminate their cover crop too early is that they end up having to terminate it too late because it's wet, because you went out to mow and your mower was broken, so you had to get it, just all of these different factors that are going to delay things. So when you're planning as part of your production plan, I think leaning towards the way earlier side, and that makes it difficult because we know that's going to mean that we're sacrificing some of that biomass. But is that biomass really going to be, that biomass is helpful in the long terms in terms of building soil organic matter, but it can come at a real detriment to the short term in terms of tying up nutrients for your crops.
Yeah. So maybe a couple weeks, not like months earlier, but a couple weeks earlier if you have a heavy biomass cover crop. Yeah. Yeah. Bethany. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a great question. So Bethany works on a farm where they have they'll have like a 5-year forage rotation. with rotational grazing, and then they'll go into a couple years of vegetables. Where do you take the sample? Do you even worry about the sample? So in the case of that flip in the rotation, where they go from the forage to the, or this counts for anybody. If you're plowing a new field that's been in a pasture, I would not worry about the standing stock of that grass when you mow it in. It is nothing. That nutrient input is nothing compared to you flipping sod in terms of the effect on the, and we know this from the farm that you work on because we did research on this. So I can say this with some level of authority that that the amount of mineralization that happens from the organic matter that hasn't been disturbed for so many years, and the net effect of that rest period plus the manure plus the forage is the net effect is different and probably greater when you combine the tillage than you trying to break that system into little pieces and account for every piece. I would rather take the temperature of the system at the time that I care about it and not maybe worry so much about mechanism. Like let's say they flip sod in February or March or something for a summer crop. I'd take that sample a month after the sod has been flipped. Does that make sense? Yeah. Anytime you're turning new ground, that kind of changes the game. That is a really big disturbance. Some folks are very averse to that kind of disturbance. It is part of, in some ways, some systems, how they maintain fertility over long term. I'm not dogmatic on it one way or another, but it is a big disturbance to the system where you create a lot of microbial respiration. It broke our instruments when we were measuring it. It was like, it blew off so much carbon. It was crazy. It was awesome. But yeah, but that piece is really, that really changes the equation on where to do that.
So I want to respect everybody's kind of, farming philosophies and things like that. Do we have anybody in here that are doing no-till heavy cover crop systems? Because that has a big influence on this availability factor, is that no-till piece.
No-till, and we are learning about cover cropping in combination with that. So trying to reduce the need for fertilizer application in general by increasing that soil organic matter via cover cropping. So that's kind of where we're at in our journey and figuring out this is doable for us to convert to no-till.
You have thoughts on that?
Well, just that, if you're doing a no-till system where you're laying the cover crop over and planting into that cover crop, that changes the dynamic completely. And part of that is that cover crop's purpose at that point isn't as much about nutrient management as it is about weed suppression and the overall benefits of the organic matter, much later in the future.
Like companion planting.
Yeah, exactly. But I just wanted to try to help us think through if there's anybody in the room that's like, okay, what do I do if I'm not tilling in my cover crops? How does that relate to my nutrient budget? And what do I do there?
Yeah, no, that is a great question. I'm glad you mentioned that, Chris, because the other thing that basically some general rules of thumb in terms of thinking about nutrients. So like we're saying, here's all the ways that you measure this. In general, we assume about 50% of the nitrogen from a cover crop actually makes it to the crop plant. It's a difficult thing to measure in terms of what's being lost with volatilization to the atmosphere and what's leached. So this is again kind of people have different schools of thought on this. Some people say 25% loss, some people say 50% loss is kind of the generally accepted amount. Again, it's a tool. But the smaller the pieces things are in, the more completely they tend to decompose. The other thing is the more they are in contact with the soil, so the organisms that are going to decompose it, the more likely it is to work its way into the soil versus being lost to volatilization. So one way you can do that, like if you're cover cropping and then going into that cover crop residue, but you want to get some of that, legume in or whatever into the system, is if it's not too wet or too cold, you could terminate that cover crop, make sure it's dead, and then as you plant into it, you can mulch over the top. And then that will help get good soil contact and keep that so the more stuff stays consistently moist, like the consistency of a wrung out sponge, so the better it's going to break down. So microbes don't like boom bust cycles of like wet, dry, hot, cold, hot, cold. They're kind of like slow and steady. So the more you can keep that environment, which no-till's great for, right? We tend to see a lot more consistent behavior in no-till soils around soil temperature and moisture than we do tilled soils. So you're setting them up, but you just want to make sure that you're feeding them and that they can get to the food. Yeah. Sure. David.
A silage tarp in that situation, should you recommend cutting it first and then applying the tarp, or?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
from
Go ahead.
From a practical standpoint, so I've tried to just smother, and especially if you've got a high biomass cover crop, it's just like it's hovering above the ground, and it's not breaking down nearly as quickly. So personally, I use a flail mower because I do like that more. It's a more conventional approach in terms of nitrogen release. I know it's going to release quickly to plants. But I think as long as even if you crimped it, right? Even if you come through, with a board and rope system, or if you've got one of those roller crimpers, getting it down to the ground is really important for that tarp efficacy, because otherwise you have so much oxygen and airflow underneath that tarps take a lot longer to work.
That's a great question. I welcome other people who use tarps. A lot of times the growers are way ahead of the university research community, especially, and that's way true in the tarping situation. Angie.
In the past, what we have done is cover crop, go through flail mowing, till in, and then go back over with flail meter to eliminate weeds. They said that was not correct.
The way we phrased it was not correct.
Because I said.
I was honest about I used it to get rid of the residue that tanks on our tanks. They said that was not a compliant. Using a flame meter. And specifically, like the verbiage on the flame meters, I could write it. The verbiage on the flame meters, you're supposed to use it to stimulate the growth of seedlings. What the flame meters are used for, talking about is getting rid of like very small microweeds. It's also very good at getting rid of any residue on top of the soil.
And I think that's where you're running into compliance issues, is with that remaining residue on top, because that goes back into the NOP where they don't want you to burn crop residue. And I know it's confusing for us because for our systems, that's not really a consideration, but for some larger scale row crop considerations, there's this whole thing about burning crop residue, and the organic system said, we don't want people to do that. So I think it's the framing of it. If you're talking about it in a weed suppression way, I think they should be okay with it. But if they're talking about burning crop residue, that's where you might get hung up.
Yeah, but I think to expound on your question a little bit, in terms of what actually the system, it's removing biomass to farming, right? You can drive that farming biomass, and that, in theory, comes with loss to water soil. Is that, am I thinking of it correct?
Yeah, and that plays into that decision there's NOP made in terms of not trying to get folks to avoid burning their crop residue, because that's not.
Right, it's gonna just like burning your whole dry field, so I understand grass. Sorry.
So you might just need to be doing a little pre-plant weed control to ensure, with flame weeding, to ensure that you have a good stand. See what I'll defer to the, yeah.
That was it. That was the first.
And I think that my frustrating part was I kept saying, but everybody does this, and he's like, no, they don't.
Yeah.
And I think what is frustrating to me about like the organic side is that sometimes you're doing the right thing, but I didn't phrase it right, and he couldn't tell me I didn't phrase it right either.
Yep.
And so it was like,
Yeah. Yeah.
Your farming practices got ahead of the system, and the system didn't really know what to do, I think is what it comes down to.
That's great. Any other questions on cover crops? Yeah. 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 Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So the comment, great comment on nitrogen deficiency after a heavy grass cover crop is you are very likely to see a little bit of nitrogen tie-up. You're seeing it in larger scale grain crop systems. You can certainly see it in a veg system. Yeah, absolutely. So something to be mindful of. And as we think, Chris is going to talk maybe a little bit about timing if we get to it. But there are ways that you can manage that in season. Like that doesn't mean don't grow an awesome winter cover crop that's heavy in biomass and grasses. It just means you need to be mindful of that decomposition window. And it may make you think, well, maybe at transplant, I maybe want to use a little fish emulsion or something like that to give it just a little bit of pop up to help your plant get established while the microbes, because the microbes will always eat first. Right, that is the rule of thumb in organic soil management. Is feed the microbes so the microbes can feed the plant, but they eat first, and they'll steal everything from your crop plant if they aren't ready to release it. Okay, cool.
We're at an hour, so
How do we want to?
I think it's really important to dig into some of the actual crop budget.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So what we're going to do is I have some tools here for you so we can kind of dig into doing some of these nutrient budgets. Maybe to kind of show you what we have here, and I'm going to go through these slides really quickly so I can just orient you to things, and then we can decide as a group whether we want to break up into smaller groups, maybe around different types of crops that people are growing, or people want to work individually, and just start putting some pen to paper and we can float around and do questions and stuff. But I'll kind of orient you to some of the stuff that's on your table and some things that you'll be able to take home with you. So the only thing we haven't really covered is measuring outputs. There's a million different ways to do this. And for those of you who are taking yield data in some way or another, bottom line, you're in great shape here. There's a bunch of tools here for folks like me who maybe don't take the greatest yield data and ways to kind of back into some of those numbers. Okay, so the basic thing that you're trying to do here is you're going to select a crop or system of interest, and then you're basically trying to determine what is the nutrient content of that crop that you're pulling out. There are different schools of thought on this. I'm going to stick with a pretty conventional and easy to access school of thought, and that is basically what's the nutrient content of the food that gets eaten that you're harvesting, right? So I'm really glad most folks are vegetable producers because this is easy data to get, right? There's a plethora of USDA data on what is the nutrient content of particular vegetables, and that's how we back into a lot of these numbers. Some estimate of yield, and you just multiply them, right? So we're going to walk through some of this. Okay, so what you have in front of you is some resources. And I've kind of excerpted those. This QR code will take you to a Google sheet where you can have downloadable versions of all this stuff. Okay, I'm just going to kind of walk you through what we set up for this. So in terms of the nutrient content, in this case, we're going to use vegetables as an example. I actually just took USDA, so I went the Not Vegetable Growers Handbook actually references USDA like Food and Ag Service data, and we just use their nutrient content for straight up for phosphorus and potassium. And so that the unit that they present that in, so this gets into the unit mathy part of this. It presents it as milligrams per 100 grams of edible portion. So kind of annoying because we have to do a conversion, but also kind of awesome because it's not dry weight. So it is actually the part that you eat. So that means you can use your yield data. You don't have to do some water conversion or something like that. So that's really great. But it does mean that to get that to where you're dealing with grams of potassium per 100 grams of portion, which is a percent, right? You just need to divide everything by 1,000. Okay, so I did that for you. So it jumps from the USDA data, from like a nutrient table, which you have a URL to look up any food you could ever want. Okay, I just picked some different vegetables on that sheet that y'all have and I converted it over to percentage. So phosphorus and potassium are straight conversions. You just divide by 1,000. The protein content, getting to nitrogen, is a little tricky, but there's a fairly standard factor. And I have a reference to this at the bottom. It's that long Food and Agriculture Organization thing, URL on there. There's basically a standard method that food scientists use, and that is that protein is typically around 16% nitrogen. Okay, so basically all we're doing, the conversion that we're doing there is saying, okay, if we have grams of protein per 100 grams of content, so that's a percent as it is, and then we just take 16% of that number. This conversion gets done different ways. There's different factors. That's just the way I set up this spreadsheet, and hopefully that's sort of explanatory between me explaining it and giving the reference, so you can see the spreadsheet is actually set up to do the math for you. I'm just telling you what's there, okay? So that's that. So the first thing we're doing is we're trying to find the nutrient content of our crop plant, and then we need to try to estimate yield. So I'm not going to go through yield estimates, although we might handle this on a case-by-case basis, but I'll tell you kind of ways. If you have, how many people take yield data already? Okay, about a quarter, half, something like that. So you can do this in whatever unit is helpful for you. Agronomic, so grain crop folks probably know how many bushels per acre and things like that they have. That's easy. It's for diversified vegetable folks, like it sounds like a lot of folks are, getting from row feet to yield per acre can be a little bit tricky. You can also, if you feel like you have a pretty good handle on square footage, like what's my yield per square foot or what's my yield per 100 square feet, just use that and scale it up, right? Just multiply it by, if it's 100 square feet, 435.6, right? So our magic number is 43,560 square feet in an acre, right? So we're just kind of working towards those. And again, you're just trying to keep your eyes on what's your end goal, what unit are you measuring your nutrients in? It's the most important thing is what's going to be relevant to you. Some people manage their nutrients on a 100 square foot basis. Some people do it on an acre basis. So there's a couple of resources in the back of that packet from Johnny's is one of them, and that is to how to go from row feet based on crop spacing to feet per acre. Okay, and so I set this up in this spreadsheet, and I'm happy to walk through it with folks, but I want you to know that that's there, and it helps you based on how many row feet goes into square foot per acre. The other thing, if folks are doing raised bed systems, like I know at the UK farm, we'll have raised beds on 6-foot centers with 2 rows in a bed, pretty common plasticulture type system. They have conversions for that too. It's based on a 6-foot bed, but basically you're just going in and kind of estimating the number of the amount of number of rows so that you can get to row feet type calculations. Am I going too fast on this? Okay. So basically, you're basing it on whatever level of yield data that you have. It's system specific, okay? And then I do have, if you don't have any kind of estimate of yield data, so Johnny's, for certain crops, they give recommendations of general yields based on row feet. There's another resource in there that is like microscopic print, and I'm sorry about that, but it's from Michigan State University, and they have a bunch of different yield estimates on a 100 square foot basis. So if you're just ballparking some ideas and you're trying to get a handle on this and you're just trying to get some working numbers, that's a good resource. Excuse me. So I'm going to take a drink of water here in a minute. So then basically you're just taking that yield estimate and then multiplying it by the percentage of the edible portion, and that gives you your crop removal rate on a pounds per acre basis. Sorry. Sorry. Sneeze like a 70-year-old man. Better get away from the mic. Okay, so those are the data that you see in those spreadsheets, and a little explanation of how we got there so that you can use whatever tools are right for you to figure out what's coming out of your system. Okay, so then let's talk about, we're not going to talk about that. Oh, okay, some other tools before I forget. So one of them is, this is very relevant to nutrient budgeting, but it's relevant to all of us. Wonderful work that Christy Durbin did, the UK CSA manager. We have a new publication out. This QR code should link you to it. And it is our production manual for all. Oh, thank you. Thanks, Chris. I'm going to chug that. It's our production manual for everything we grow on the UK CSA. So there's stuff in there. It is set up to be a fairly mechanized system, but like our home farm, I just use the BCS and it's a small market garden. I use the fertility recommendations, the production guides, days to transplant. There's a ton of great information in there on how to grow. I feel like it is the organic gardening and farming guide for Kentucky. I'm biased, but she did a wonderful job on this. And there's tons of resources embedded in that, including their crop fertility calculator. It's always easier if you build your own spreadsheet because the math is clearer to you. But if you want to see how Christy and Aaron and Bethany and others set this all up for a farm that has all of the things that go into it that we've been talking through, cover crops, they're counting for organic matter, they're counting for compost, they're counting for fertilizer, accounting for fertigation. It is like it has got all, it's the kitchen sink in there.
We just got that, they just dropped it at my house.
You can order, yes. Yeah, and if they don't have it at the extension office, you can request a copy to be mailed. So just talk to your extension agent, or you can also download it online. So totally free, awesome resource, great fertility workbook, relevant to us in here, and also just in general. Okay, bio break, press on. Press on, yes. Okay, okay. In our kind of last time together, we wanted folks to have a chance to start thinking through this process and then hit Chris and I up for questions, also ping each other. There's a lot of expertise in this room, and to start perhaps building a nutrient budget or tackling the problem that's nutrient fertility oriented for your own situation. Do people want to do that? The other option would be to talk a little bit more about nutrient management in general, around timing, kind of the nuances of pre-season, in-season fertility management, things like that. Kind of where.
So do folks want to put numbers to paper, start going through some actual nutrient budgets and get to the nuts and bolts? Some folks may already be doing that. And might be more interested in hearing us, cover more of some of the dynamics about how these things behave. So what's the temperature in the room?
How do you do this without your own soil? You don't necessarily need a soil test to put together a budget, because your first step would be to look at what's going in and what rate am I applying it, and then what's coming out, right? So you're putting in your pluses into the bank account and then your minuses and trying to get numbers around that. And then we use and of course you wouldn't be able to get your organic matter, which, for you all that might be quite important, knowing a little bit about your composting history and the amount you cover crop and stuff. But you could you would miss the organic matter part, but you could also kind of guess. It's not incredibly granular. It's like, if we know we're about 5%, we're about 7%, whatever. And then kind of back into that number there. So we could do that. Yeah? Or no? People are like, oh my God, no, that's a waste. Yeah. Do people feel like well, I guess maybe another way to think about that is, do people feel like they have enough information on kind of how to think about inputs and outputs that they could do this on their own? That was really the thinking behind this, is like, let people try it out. But you feel like conceptually you're ready to go, or no? Willing to try? Yeah.
So one thing we probably can't do today is take a nutrient budget for your for your farm and go back and you'll just be ready to go. So what we'll be doing is more of a demo where we're taking kind of theoretical numbers, plugging that in, and just showing the nuts and bolts how those relate. But we just want to make sure that you all feel comfortable with, these different components to have reached that step. So ultimately the goal is you go back to your farm, you develop your own system, whether you like to do a spreadsheet, maybe you want to, you're old fashioned like me and want to do it on paper, however that works for you. But we want to give you the tools you all need to be able to go back and create a nutrient budget for your farm. So.
Yeah. Okay, we can do that. Let me go back. That's a good way to do it. Yeah, we'll go back to this first one here, and I'll kind of walk you through. Boop. Here, yeah, okay. So let's walk through this example, and I'll walk you through the math on it. That's, I think, the thing that's probably the most intimidating for people is how, and the main thing, I will say on the math, like, I also make mistakes. I love math problems, but doesn't mean I'm particularly good at them. So you kind of want to have, kind of know like if something looks weird, check your math. Like that's kind of my usual rule of thumb here. So I started with what I know, right? And so what our current practice was, which was we applied compost, thoroughbred compost from, Creech or wherever. It's kind of a standard one that's available around here, commercially available. We applied it at a rate of 10 tons per acre. Well, how do I know how much compost I'm applying if I do it by site, or if I do it by, I apply about an inch or something like that? So what you want to do is measure kind of a known volume. So you can do that by weight. So you could say, or if you have a standard practice of like, we apply 5 buckets of compost for every bed, right? Weigh a bucket and say, okay, or these 5 buckets weigh X and it covers, my bed is this many square feet. Okay, and that'll give you your pounds per square feet. And then you just convert that to pounds per acre. Okay, so you don't have to necessarily, alter your current practice. You just want to get numbers around your current practice. And so you can do that, just do what you normally do and try to get an estimate. And again, an estimate is good. This is not a mass balance where you're accounting for every atom, you're just trying to get in the ballpark.
I would say use common sense. So if your compost is soaking wet, yes, or something like that, make some adjustments there in terms of weight, because the moisture content is going to be hugely variable.
Yes. Yep, absolutely. That's a super good point. Yeah, and it could be too, like if you have a big pile of compost and it's wet on top, but it's fairly dry in the middle, because it's a little bit hydrophobic, scrape the top off and sample from the middle. Representative sample of what you're applying. Yep. And so then for this particular one, I actually used a UK publication. I didn't even use a test. So they say that we have an extension publication on composting horse muck. And they said in general, it's about 2% nitrogen, 1% phosphorus, 2% potassium. So I just used that book value. And then the way that relates out, this is important. The compost question about release comes into play here. So you take 10 tons per acre, so that's 20,000 pounds of compost, right? So 2,000 pounds in a ton. So 20,000 pounds of compost times 2% is, I don't know, I need to get my calculator.
This is why spreadsheets are so helpful with these systems, is because you can build in the calculations And you're going to build it wrong the first couple of times, but as you go along, you tweak it, and all of a sudden you just plug in the numbers and it spits
That's
out
right.
numbers for you.
That's
And
right.
That's so helpful. I know, like I said, I'm a little bit old fashioned, but I've been converted to Excel and spreadsheets just because it reduces your workload in the long run.
100%. And I like doing things back of the envelope, because usually I'm like doing it on the fly and I don't have time to get in front of my computer or whatever. But I just keep redoing the same work over and over. And I'm like, why can't I remember this? So anyway, I should have been able to do this in my head, but it's 400 pounds of nitrogen. And you're like, oh my God, 400 pounds of nitrogen. But remember, it's releasing, we're applying a lot. That's a high application rate. And it was releasing over 5 years. So I took that straight line 5-year method, right? And so I took our 400 pounds of N and I divided it by 5. So that gives me my 80 pounds of nitrogen for that year. And then did the same thing with the phosphorus and the potassium. Okay. So that's the compost piece. Everybody feel reasonably good about that? Okay. And then the 855 fertilizer, that one's easy. It tells me what the composition is. And I know that I've followed the UK ID 36, and we did 100 pounds of N pre-plant fertilizer. And then I didn't do the fertigation in season here. We do that based on foliar testing, whether we need it or not. But we put 100 pounds N down pre-plant. So that's 855 on the nutrient content. And then in terms of pounds per acre, it's 100 pounds of N. And then I'm pegging my quantity based on the nitrogen content. So then that ends up being 63 pounds of phosphorus and 63 pounds of potassium. Do people feel comfortable about that? It's kind of basic fertilizer. Maybe yes, maybe no. Okay, so this is actually, you kind of have to back engineer into back into your numbers. So what I would do if I read my ID 36 and it said, and I knew I wanted, or whatever, you're applying 100 pounds of N per acre rate. In that case, I'm going into a high tunnel and my bed is 3 feet wide by 70 feet long. So I know that I need to figure out how many acres that bed is so I can figure out how much to add. I wish we had a whiteboard. It'd be a lot easier than me like doing it in my head and explaining what's going on in my head, which is like always dangerous. So let's say, so if it's 3 feet wide by 70 feet long, that's 210 square feet. Then I'm going to divide that by 60 feet in an acre. So it's 0.005 acres. Okay, so that's how many square feet is in that bed. Okay, or how many acres is in that bed. And then I would multiply that times 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre times, for every pound of fertilizer, there'd be 0.8 pounds of nitrogen in there. And that would give me the number that I'm applying, which hopefully I did that right. Let me think about that. 0.08 pounds. Yes, 0.08 pounds, because 8%, not 80%. So that would be, let's see, so times 100 pounds in per acre. And then that would be, yeah, so it ends up being 6 pounds fertilizer a bed. That sounds common sense, like what we spread. So that's how I would get into the amount of fertilizer that I'm applying. So from a nutrient budgeting perspective, I've already done that. That happened, last year. But if you were trying to figure out how much fertilizer to apply based on a rate, that's how you do it.
When I crunch that out, it's
Yep.
How seriously should I take that discrepancy?
Awesome question. So the question is crop removal, like basically it looks low, right? Compared to what we think a crop is going to take up. It is definitely not what your crop needs. So it may come out that you're only like a tomato crop removals like 50 pounds of N per acre or something that's really low, or 30 or 15 or something. Yep. So then you hit the critical point there, Patrick. So so he was saying like the crop removal rates kind of based on what he thought hit the potassium pretty well, but the nitrogen was about 1/3 of what they know they need to be effective. So a couple things there. One of them's the nitrogen dynamics, right? So we lose a lot of nitrogen in systems, and there is some thought that also the more organic, like the richer nitrogen content we have in systems, the less nitrogen use efficient our plants actually are. So it would not be surprising at all to have to use. The question is, should you use crop removal as an estimate of the fertilizer that you should add and what you've lost? No. No, because you'll come up short. But it helps you know what you're losing. And many times in organic systems where we're compost and manure dependent, what nutrient budgets often do is help us identify our excesses and where are we spending money we don't need to spend.
Can I give an example really quickly? So right now we've got 855, right? This fertilizer that we're applying, right? If we plug that into our bigger picture, all of the other inputs and outputs and things like that, and we can look down here and see where we have these excesses and these, points where we need to improve on, then a management decision there might be come back and change this 855, right?
Yep.
Okay, 855 means that our budget, based on all of the other inputs, is off. So is it cost effective for us to go find a different formulation, plug that in, and get these numbers closer, right? So that's just one example of how we can use these nutrient budgets as a tool to make management decisions.
Yep. So in this case, we actually moved away from the compost and moved more, and again, this is a tomato crop that's a heavy potassium feeder, but moved more towards concentrating around, to some extent, nitrogen, but we were finding actually a lot of nitrogen carryover. So we just really started pushing it, like potassium became our biggest concern in that system and this is very common in tunnels over the course of a couple years. Okay, so then the last input in this particular situation is that organic matter. So this gets into the estimated nitrogen release. So we assumed 3% organic matter, or that's about what our samples show. Could we stand for that to be higher? Probably, but that's about what it is, and I can live with it. And so then we just assumed 20 pounds per N per acre per year. So that's exactly what Waters did in that sample that Chris saw. I ran the numbers on my phone. I'm like, I think that's X percent. So it's 20 pounds. So again, it doesn't tell you anything about mineralization, right? But it just shows you that it's there. If you're going into a controlled environment like a tunnel or something that you've got covered, it's probably going to stay there actually. And so we start to see that carry over year. Okay, so then in the outputs, so we have two things here. So this is a weird example because it's a tunnel and crop biomass is very important. But we'll start with the harvest. And so the way that I did this, I have to try to remember how I did this, but it's in terms of estimating the yield, I think I estimated, I can't remember how many pounds per plant, but that was the unit that we tend to take. And then that, I can't, I think it was 5 pounds per plant or something, which is pretty low, but those were kind of crappy yields anyway, those first couple years. So let's say 5 pounds or 7 pounds per plant or whatever. You have a general idea. You could also do it based on, in this particular context of a tunnel or a field, what you get off that row. If you have, so whatever unit you have that works, and then you scale it. In this case, I scaled it to the tunnel, which was 30 foot by 72 foot. And then I just took that and scaled that to an acre. So it was whatever the 2,100 square feet of the tunnel, and then divided that into how many acres it was. So that gave me, I was able to scale that yield to about 28,560 pounds per acre, which, yeah, Maggie.
So when you're doing the crop harvest,
Yep. Yep. It depends. So you can do it two ways. I think they actually have carrots with top in the USDA database. If you leave the carrots in place and put them in like you might in the open field, some people might do that, then don't worry about them because they're going back into the system, right? They don't count as a removal. But yeah, I think you would estimate it as, you would look for an estimate of carrot with top, or if you can find an estimate of, carrot, you would want to know something about the biomass. You just basically want to be able to estimate if you know that you could back into that number however makes sense to you. So if you could, yes, yeah. So I wouldn't worry about it from a removal perspective, because if your tops go back in the bed, they're still cycling in the system. You haven't really removed them. Does that make sense? They're basically they're a green manure, right? Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a good question. And then crop biomass. So I base this on some numbers that we had because we actually measured this. So about, on a determinate tomato, about what the biomass was per plant, and I multiplied that out times my planting density. You could do, so again, this is a weird case. If we're talking about open field for most folks, market gardeners in the open field, your crop residue, whether it's your, broccoli stalk or, whatever else, that's going back in. So you don't have to worry about this. This is in the situation where you're pulling the whole plant out and it's leaving the system.
Think about tomatoes, right? Yep. Most of us are trying to remove that whole plant so that we're not continuing those pest and disease cycles, for example. So some of the things like carrots, you don't have to worry about that as much because we don't have those same pest and disease cycles. But yeah, think about what crops you're removing everything from and what crops you can reincorporate.
Yeah, yeah. And so in that case, I had an estimate on a per plant basis. I estimate, and then I multiplied that times my plant population per tunnel, and then equated that to per acre. Do people feel comfortable, like they could do that on their own with whatever their own kind of system is? It's a bit of converting. Happy to sit down with folks too and think through, but most of the time the nutrient recommendations are on a pounds per acre basis. So you're going to want to take, even if you're a smaller scale them up so that it's apples to apples kind of comparison. So then multiply that by the nutrient content. In this case, I think that I looked that one up online. It was some scientific publication. But again, this was a weird example, so I wouldn't send you down that this is the rabbit hole part. So in this particular context, it was relevant. And the reason I cared about it is because it's so much biomass, right? I wouldn't care if it was some random little thing and we barely pulled a small amount out and be like, that's a hard number to get. It doesn't really count for much anyway. But in this case, it was a huge tomato plant biomass. And you can see from the pounds of nutrients removed per acre, we're actually pulling more nutrients out through the plant than we are through the tomatoes. Right? And so in this context, and because tomatoes are such a heavy potassium feeder, we're really pulling out a ton of potassium here. Well, that creates ongoing problems when we think about fruit ripening disorders in tomatoes, which are heavily dependent on potassium content. But you can see we're pulling out a lot of nitrogen too. So quite a bit more than what was in the fruit. So then all we do is we just add them up, right? So we add up the numbers on the top, we subtract them from the ones on the bottom, and this gives us our nutrient budget for this particular crop, right? So we come up a little high on the N, come up pretty high on the phosphorus, and we know we don't need any help with that anyway, so we shouldn't be applying phosphorus. So our soil test tells us we're already very high in phosphorus. And here I am dumping, every time I grow a tomato crop, I'm dumping 70 more pounds per acre of nitrogen in there. So probably not awesome. But I'm coming up short on potassium. And I can infer from the quantity removed here that my problem probably wouldn't be near as bad in the field where I'm not removing that tomato biomass, but in the tunnel it's bad. And it actually could be even worse because a lot of times tomatoes get a lot bigger in tunnels than they do in the open field, or you might even be growing some greenhouse variety that's a monster and goes all the way up. So it kind of gets, this is a weird example, but every farm has a weird example. There's some weird situation where you manage something in one way, or you've got livestock integrated, or you're, do X, Y, and Z. Not that that's a weird thing, but in terms of everybody's budget is their own story, right? And they're pretty variable. So
something we can think about here is, okay, we've got some excess nitrogen, we've got a lot of excess phosphorus, and we need some more potassium. What would it look like to break up this 855?
Yep.
And instead do a 1300 for the nitrogen so that we can better adjust this number more independently of the fertilizer, right?
Yeah.
And then we can use potassium sulfate or something like that. And actually, what we might see is that by doing those adjustments independently, we can actually save a little bit in terms of fertilizer because we're not having to apply this nutrient that we don't actually need.
Yes.
So I know it's a little bit of a, sometimes it feels like those balanced fertilizers are just nice because we know that we can apply everything in one go. But sometimes it makes more economic sense to take one or the other and mix them and just do that little extra step of mixing that fertilizer, and it make a huge difference for us economically and in terms of plant health, right?
And the other thing that I might be inclined to do, knowing that this is a tunnel that's been undercover for a while, we're not measuring nitrogen with a standard soil test, but we know tunnels often carry a lot of nitrogen over because we don't have the normal leaching processes that we have in the open field. So I might run it like a saturated media extract because that test will give you nitrogen. And so I might do that and then see if I know I'm probably running rich on N anyway, I might see how much is there and then use a 1300 pre-plant, maybe cut it back on the initial and then do more in-season foliar sampling and fertigate with nitrogen or potassium. But again, that really depends on what you're set up to do and how much you want to tweak. And that's not my livelihood, right? That's UK farm. So I might be more inclined to experiment there. But that gets to another point where if you want to make changes, but you're not quite sure, you don't have to do it on everything. You could do a bed by bed comparison, right? And be like, I think my data are pointing me in this way. Maybe I can cut back a little bit. And that's kind of what we did at the CSA is we didn't really trust our fertility calculator. It's kind of like, are we getting the cover crop estimate right? Does this organic matter really, we know it's there, but is it there when we need it and stuff like that? And so it was kind of slow steps. And bless you. And now where we are on that is we fall apply compost. And we get it from one of the other UK farms. It's not certified, so we have to treat it like manure. But our organic matter levels are pretty high. We have a lot of fertility. So now we're to the point where our nutrient budgets and visually what we're seeing with our yields, using some common sense there, we're kind of like, maybe it's time to cut the compost. So that's kind of how, so it kind of leads you to these incremental steps around your fertility management as your system evolves.
And so not only does this affect, your fertilizer costs, but if you're looking at something like this, where you have a surplus in a high tunnel system and that carries over year to year, you can, I start seeing things like whitefly issues or aphid issues. And so this can help you curb some of those, either nutrient surpluses or nutrient deficits that lead to some of those plant disorders and disease and pest issues as well.
It just use this sort of soluble salt rather than tunnel. So is there a way to use this, or how might this help with that?
Yeah, great question. So the question was, how might this factor into soluble salts? So what it might help you do is there's another tool that you would use outside of nutrient content, and it's called a salt index. So every fertilizer has its own salt index, and you can find these for organic fertilizers as well. You just want to Google salt index organic fertilizers. I think actually the Knott's Vegetable Handbook has a table in there. If you don't have that book and you want to see this, just email me and I'll send you a PDF of that table. But what you would want to do is if you have a buildup of soluble salts in your tunnel, you want to switch to a lower salt index fertilizer. And so you might look at different potassium alternatives. Potassium sulfate, many times in organic systems, we're using lower salt index fertilizers compared to conventional anyway, with the exception of Chilean nitrate and things like that. Yep. Is it? Okay. Okay. Yeah. But potassium sulfate's way better than potassium chloride. But that would be where it could steer you a little bit in terms of knowing where, and then you also anytime you're reducing your fertilizer inputs, you're reducing your salt load. The other thing that you might look at, and this is getting out of my wheelhouse on soil chemistry, is the alkalinity of your water. That also influences soluble salt content in ways I'd have to go look up again. I don't have that off the top of my head, but yeah.
I have a question about stuff you do multi-year. So like you said, do year 2, would you take any of these numbers?
That's a great question.
Rollover?
Yeah, rollover. Maybe I can take an initial stab.
Yeah, please do.
We were talking about this before as well. I would, on the nitrogen, think about carryover if you're not measuring nitrogen in your soil test. I wouldn't, because nitrogen is so important. It's our most limiting nutrient, right? I wouldn't do anything crazy because crop removal does not necessarily indicate nitrogen utilization by the plant. Plant's going to use a lot more than what we're just removing. But I would use the soil test as your check. So I would think about carryover, but then I would take a soil test again at the same time, because you're going to see that buildup, right? Like you're going to see buildup of phosphorus and potassium year to year. So I think where the nutrient budget fits in looking at soil test, nutrient budget, soil test, nutrient budget, soil test, nutrient budget, it helps you understand mechanistically, like if I'm having a buildup, what am I bringing in that's causing that to build up, right? And then where are my loss pathways? And if like you have a high phosphorus soil and you don't have a high phosphorus feeding crop, you're just, contributing more to the problem. So, but you'll get that your soil test data will be more reliable of the situation that your plant's going to experience and guide your fertility management than your nutrient budget. Does that make sense? They're companions, and your test is your check, and your nutrient budget's kind of your mechanism. Yeah. Questions? Do you want to field some in-season fertility management? Go to that part? Okay.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
How much time do we want to leave for questions?
That's up to you all. You've been practicing them throughout, so there's 20 minutes left in the session.
Yeah. Does it feel good to you all if we leave about 10 minutes at the end for questions and some back and forth conversation? That work for you all? Great.
Did you have a question? I'm just wondering if there's a template that. I'll put one in there. Yeah, I can do that. Yeah. Oh yeah, yes. Yeah, I could do that for yeah. I can do that. I'll put it on for these worksheets and all that stuff on there. I'll put it up on that spreadsheet, that same Google sheet, and then you can download it and manipulate it.
Yes, sir.
I have an slightly unrelated question. When I first started gardening on my property about 15 years ago, with our heavy clay, I read on the web that breaking up the clay with gypsum was a useful thing to do. And then since then I've seen that gypsum isn't helpful at all. So what do you know about that?
Gypsum. So we're actually we got a few little trials going on, some high tunnels. They're not research level by any means, but gypsum is one of the things that we're amending with to see what the effect is with clay. And we've only had it in practice for 1 year, so I'm not sure where we're at with that. We're looking at that, especially as a tool for compacted soils in high tunnels. Does anybody else in the room have experience with gypsum and what its role might be in breaking up that compaction?
I said, did it work? I'm from Nevada.
Yeah.
We have lots of clay there, and we were building our soil in Nevada.
Yeah.
It seemed to work.
It seemed to be effective for you? Yeah.
We went from death and waste away. Something workable that we could grow grass in.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it could really depend on your clay particle size and how that interacts with the gypsum. So I think there's some factors in there that could either make or break you that sometimes can be a little bit beyond our control. What is the actual soil composition type versus, what size of gypsum? I don't want to speculate into that, but
this is sort of the soil heat science market, like where you got a plate where so many of those electrons will be on that plate, and your soil is high in calcium, gypsum is way high in calcium, for the more calcium, not leak enough of that. I initially using the water gypsum and my calcium, the way you started rocket high. It works good, it's nice to know your soil.
We were always told that it wouldn't work in Kentucky soils, as it doesn't. It does in other areas of the country. I think it needs to be adjusted.
Yeah.
That you're doing
where my service area is in eastern Kentucky, I often find that, when a blanket statement like doesn't work in Kentucky soils is made, Kentucky's a pretty broad region. Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's so much difference, like, and so much research comes out from out west, like, vegetable best in the states are really growth, like, okay, like, here in Kentucky, there's so many things that are different. Krista, I cringe a little every time you say the phosphorus level things, because it's super true up in the West local region, but you get way out west, like, we're super low phosphorus, like, I got it's just such a diverse state, and depending on where the research comes from, and how it's used today, there's very little rainfall versus other sometimes monsoon season.
There are parts of the country where they cannot get phosphorus in a complete fertilizer. And it's just, I think it's up in the Northeast where, they've just banned it for homeowners and everybody else because, again, it's not nature.
Right. Yeah, that's.
Yes, sir.
So if gypsum is not helpful for a particular soil, can it be harmful?
Well, going back to the calcium thing, I think that's, take up exchange sites and throw off your nutrient balances, things like that. So anything that you don't need, can kind of throw the balance off the other way, right? When we're looking at soil health, we really are, in a lot of ways, looking at a balance equation, right? And when we throw that balance off by applying things we don't need, that's when we tend to get into trouble, in my experience. I can't speak from experience on that. Here's what I do know. Most of the soil tests I get back show very low sulfur in Kentucky soils. But I've also heard that adding sulfur doesn't really make a difference in terms of yield. So most of the resources I've seen in the UK say, okay, yeah, you're going to see the sulfur's low, but you don't necessarily need to. But your question is, I need to add sulfur anyway because I'm trying to bring my pH down. Is that going to be harmful? Is that what I'm hearing? Yeah.
I would look up sulfur toxicity levels and just see if they're in the This is, I also have no direct experience with this. But that would be what I would look at, more from just a crop health and toxicity perspective, and see if you're in all parts of approaching. No, just that some things go up numerically doesn't mean it always biologically relevant, right? So we have to look at and say, like, okay, the number is doing this, but what does it mean?
When you apply sulfur, lower that pH, in our soils, it's not going to stay there. It's going to go right back to the basic in a few years.
To some extent, we're going to met with the guidance around this. I'd be curious, Hannah Poffenbarger, who's presenting tomorrow, way more like and she would know. She might be able to give us some interest, like some of these nuanced questions, like to what extent does that organic matter buffer pH and things like that. I would trust her. If anyone at UK, I would trust her expertise more than anybody to handle these kind of complex questions. She's why I got you on that stuff.
One kind of related question that I get a lot and have gotten different answers on, and maybe I'll throw it out to the room and to Krista. You know, folks that are trying to build their organic matter through manure and compost and see those phosphorus levels just get jacked way up. We know that the phosphorus levels can have some implications for our natural resources, especially water contamination, things like that. Even though it's not quite as mobile as nitrogen, so it doesn't leach quite as bad. But once we see those, excuse me, sorry about that. Once we see those those phosphorus levels shoot up in the soil test, is that going to affect other things? Is that going to tie up exchange sites? Is that going to cause nutrient deficiencies in other ways? Does anybody have any experience with that?
Yeah, you know, my good citizen Pat, you know, says I shouldn't over-apply phosphorus, things like that. But I had a consultant actually who works for a friend of mine's farm push me on this and say, how big of a deal are high phosphorus levels anyway? It's high throughput, really good tunnel grower, does not have time for crops. Like supplying compost. She's supplying as low a phosphorus compost that she possibly can. She's doing the best she can, but her phosphorus levels are high. How big of a deal is it? She doesn't have the answer for it. I actually asked Hannah the same question, and she said, until you start into issues where you completely saturated all your basin and your capacity and things like that, it's probably not that much of an issue. And by the time you're increasing, you're adding a lot of compost and organic matter, you're also increasing your fertilization capacity, so you can pull more nutrients. And so we don't have a great answer to say, like, don't do that because it's going to be bad for your crop, because you're going to get a phosphorus toxicity issue, or phosphorus is going to compete with X nutrient, you're going to have the problem. I'm pressed on this because it's outside of my wheelhouse, and I can't get anybody to say that. That's not to say we're resolved with all things about using a lot of compost, but it gets weird when organic matter levels get really high, but it's still framed as a resource, a natural resource. Water quality.
To date, I've seen a lot of soil tests come back super high in phosphorus, and I haven't seen any production-related issues with it. I've done the same, tried to pin people down. I found a soil scientist on an airplane one time and sat next to her and tried to get her butt. Yeah, so, but it's a question I get from a lot of producers. You know, they rely heavily on that compost inputs. Maybe they have really sandy soils, really clay soils, and that organic matter is super important for their system. So just something I wanted to address since we're talking about all these nutrient surplus and deficits. So, I think at this point we've got maybe about 5 minutes till we wrap up. So let's just keep the questions. What else do y'all have for us?
Fill out your survey, because I will find you. I've memorized all of your cases, and I will find you.
Which one is to leave on the table?
Can you bring that QR code up on the slide?
Yeah. Krista, which direction?
I think you all get access to this. They'll make it available to everybody. And then oh yeah, those are some other things for estimating cover crop biomass and things like that. Those QR codes have like some different kinds of videos for estimating cover crop nitrogen credits. There's a good publication that Chris has resources from, and there's a calculator. The annoying thing is it only works if you're in Georgia. So it's great for people who live in Georgia, or close to the border or something, but you need a soil sample from their service to do it. So, so good resources there. Can you tell I'm a million learning to the QR code? That's and this is the same one as in the next slide. So there's a Google sheet that you can link to on this. Let me know if you can't access it. But every print page that you have is a sheet in that Google sheet. So you can, and it has all of the math built in. So if you have any, I try to put a few notes in there so that you can download it and do whatever you want. And then all of the primary references for where the numbers came from in the spreadsheets are all at the bottom. So if there's a project that you want to do that's not in there, so get information on that.
Yeah, and you can reach out to me. I have email, phone number, that type of thing put up here. And I can bother Krista too. So, yeah, let's keep this conversation going, because I think as we move towards a future where our inputs, our costs are continuing to go up and up, and availability is really a struggle, and we as organic producers are having to manage all of these new elements. I think this is going to continue to be really important. And, I think Krista and I are going to continue to be doing similar workshops and advising farmers. So if you see other things that come up for you and your farm that are helpful, please share that with us so we can update this material or anything else that we can do so we can help farmers better in the future.
Alexis brought up a good point. For those of you who are working in high tunnels, we're got our extension vegetable specialist, Rachel Rudolph, has been doing a really cool statewide project where she's sampling for root knot nematode in high tunnels, which is an emerging test here, and we have a lot more tunnels, and people are starting to see issues there. Cover cropping is often thought of as a way to break the root knot nematode cycle, but you have to find a non-host. They feed widely on different kinds of crops. So there's a table. Yeah.
For like warm season, cool season, depending on what you grow in your tunnel, if you need a cover crop in there. The reason I bring it up is because if you're trying to decide nutrient management-wise and what cover crop to incorporate, you know that one is not a host for root knot nematode. It can make that decision-making process a little bit easier. You can incorporate those numbers without break the cycle that way. We're seeing it a lot more. Dr. Rudolph will have better explanation, but I can speak from Boyle County in Danville, and it was thought that it was not there, and we sampled several tunnels with incredibly high numbers of nematode, so not only it skyrocketed. So if you grow up in high tunnels, really be thinking about that, and I would, maybe I'm just speaking as an agent, but I would just assume that you are going to need to break that cycle. So if you can do that through cover cropping, get the benefits of the nutrients, that would be great to start thinking about in the next couple of years.
Google like cover crops for high tunnels. There's two extension publications, one for cool season cover crops for tunnels, one for warm season. And it's all based on research. We're recommending cover crops for tunnels.
Just to add a note to that, I think even the cultivar of the cover crop can have an effect on whether it's opposed to that nematode or not. Like I know several cultivars of oats are not. Oats are usually a go-to for people, but if you get the wrong cultivar, they still like it. So it's a tricky problem.
If you have somebody's concerned about soluble salts, with testing, recommend they do.
issue we need to be worried about?
The one I've always done is through water tag. I have not done some of the results test. Regulatory, yeah, but it's the same, and they should give you a key in terms of, okay, this level's okay. Oh, this level you might start to see some impacts, but it's not going to be, super problematic all the way down to, this place is the desert. Go find somewhere else.
They measure it's either called total cellular salt TSS or electrical conductivity.
Yeah. I think the electrical conductivity is the one that I've seen. And with that, there are some management strategies, but they're typically a little bit painful for those of us in high tunnels who are used to just putting crop after crop after crop through it. One, of course, is to remove the covering on the high tunnel for several months and allow Kentucky's generous level of rainfall to control that out. So some of us, for some producers, can easily do that, right? If we're producing tomatoes in our high tunnel, we can take it off during the rainy winter months and have that advantage. Some folks who are producing it year round, I've seen one lady I'm working with rented a tanker truck and went down the river and spilled it up and ran a deluge of water through the river high tunnel, so she didn't have to take it out of production. What you need to know from that is the amount of water in inches per square foot that you need to flood the salt. And so there's calculations for that. University of Kentucky has a great publication that talks about the amount of water that you need to flush this.
There's a soil salinity high tunnel extension hub, but I will say it's not as easy as you think. Like this may just be a more silt lump, so it's very nice filtering as well. We have the salty tunnel, which is a good research problem to have, and not a great problem in life. But we did this experiment where we had did nothing. We applied 6 inches of water with like misty, like a micro sprinkler system, and we did a foot of water. And we looked at salt movement through the soil profile at 18 inches. And you think the foot of water that you pushed the salt, but what ended up happening, it moved it just a little bit, but not appreciably, and it grew a tomato crop back of it. So that was the effect on no water. So we were particularly interested in what we found barely moved the needle. I was talking to a soil physicist about this, and he was like, we applied it wrong. You did it like a gentle soaking rain. You got a foot of water pushed it. So like the deluge from the river is what we have to do. You can't just apply the water. It's just gonna percolate gently through the soil. You got a flood. I have a solution to that. You have a ton of flood? Yeah, I do. Ours will